Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, and I'm a member of the Westside Preservation Alliance, San Antonio's leader in grassroots historic preservation advocacy. Today is the final event of our 2020 Tenayuca Speaker Series, formerly called the Westside Community History and Preservation Speaker Series, which highlights innovative work in community history, historic preservation, and social justice. This is also our very first attempt to present a virtual symposium broadcast from multiple locations. Before the pandemic, we hoped to join the community here in the beautiful Guadalupe Theater for a full day of panels, conversations, a lunch, and a walking tour. We hope we can do something like that next year. But for now, our community safety is the priority, and we're thankful for this technology that's allowing us to create, to come to you today virtually. We do ask that if we experience a hiccup with the technology, please bear with us, and we will work as fast as we can to overcome any hurdles. I want to thank the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center for hosting today's event, the Esperanza Peace Justice Center, which has been a co-sponsor of all of the Tenayuca Speaker Series events, and also Esperanza is providing the technical support behind today's symposium. I want to thank all of the people who came in to work on a Saturday to help us. And I also want to thank Humanities Texas, the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the City of San Antonio's Department of Arts and Culture, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Texas Commission on the Arts, the John L. Santikos Charitable Foundation of the San Antonio Area Foundation, the Coyote Phoenix Fund, the Castañeda Madrid Fund, the Foundation for a Just Society, the Ford Foundation, y la buena gente de Esperanza. I'm also obliged to tell you that any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in today's program do not necessarily represent those of Humanities Texas or the National Endowment for the Humanities. Finally, this is a hard time for our city's arts and cultural organizations. If you'd like to help support programs like this, please visit the websites of the Esperanza, of the Guadalupe, and others to make a donation. Everything helps. I hope you enjoyed today's event. Questions can be typed into the comments, and we'll do our best to answer them. Now I would like to invite Cristina Ballí, Executive Director of the Guadalupe, to the stage for a message. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to this symposium that we're very excited to host, even if it's not on the live version, but at least a virtual version. We're able to bring this wonderful program to many more of you that can tune in that are perhaps not in town. We know that the Guadalupe Theater is located in the epicenter of what was the Barrio Guadalupe. And so this historical symposium of the history of the area and the history of the Westside is very important to us. We are part of that history as an institution and as a physical space. We have many buildings that the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center owns and operates in this corner. So including the Progreso Pharmacy building, which is across the street from this theater, which has been renovated in 2 phases, and the entire first floor is renovated, and that someday soon we hope will open up as a community gallery and a bookstore and gift shop, and that is right across the street from us. We hope in the future to be able to host some of this Tenayuca Symposium in the Progreso Community Gallery as well. So I want to thank Sarah Gould for putting this together. I'm happy to be continuing to work with her and our friends at the Esperanza Peace Justice Center, particularly all the staff that puts together and works on the Rinconcito de Esperanza, which is just a couple of blocks away from us here. So thank you very much for joining everybody today. Welcome to the symposium. I'd like to welcome you in person at the Guadalupe Theater, but we hope to do that soon. Please enjoy today's program.
Thank you. Okay. I think so. They turned us off.
You know,
So
yeah,
I think.
If that looks too different of a color, I can turn on the house lights and that might be sufficient.
You know, up a teeny bit. I'm sorry.
Y'all can hear me, Sergio?
what's that?
Okay, that's pretty good.
Back over here.
Up or down?
Do you want to see?
You just flip it around? Okay, just go to sit down. Okay, yeah, okay, I just flip it down. Oh, yeah. You can. You can point it.
But you have to turn our camera off to see us when we're talking, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I think that'll be fine. I think that'll be okay. Yeah, that'll be okay. That'll be easier too.
You don't think we should try to have that behind me? I don't know. I just.
Okay.
It's
you
just,
want
this is
to
a
go
very
ahead and
pretty
sit there?
space,
Go
so
ahead
I
and
just.
sit there.
Okay.
I would just like to highlight this.
Hang on.
Yes. Correct.
Correct.
Okay, so then can we see the how you're going to be changing the slides?
We don't see the screen. We don't see what our sides. That is not our presentation.
Okay, go ahead.
Here.
That's it.
Perfect. Are we ready?
Yes.
So thank you everyone for coming in and for the Westside History Symposium. My name is Sergio Arturo Iruegas and my wife is
Melinda Iruegas.
and we've been doing archaeology for over 30 years, and we were asked to do a presentation on what we understand the West Side in the context of all of our research. And so I wanted to go before the San Antonio missions and the period right after to kind of describe what we know about the West Side, because a lot of this information is not taught to us in schools. And so at the very beginning, what we do know, if we can advance to the next slide, what we do know about the people who lived here is that right now they are called the Coahuiltecans, but that's just a language. The people today, the direct lineal descendants, refer to themselves as Coahuiltecos or Tejanos. And a lot of the information that we are now beginning to see is what we understand from our perspective. What we know and have been taught is what others in the anthropological sense has provided to us based on analysis of the same types of records, the Spanish exploration records, and it all began with Cabeza de la Vaca. Now, the thing about Cabeza de la Vaca is he was shipwrecked and he didn't come with an entourage, and the people in the greater Texas area were already working within an advanced trade network system. And so when people came through and they didn't look like they had anything to really trade, they did not get to see the great majority of the villages. So what I'm saying is Cabeza de Vaca only got to see just a little bit of what was actually here in Texas. Now, because of that, all of the information that we know about the prehistoric period of Texas before the Spanish made a direct contact with us is based on those types of encounters, as well as some encounters in the 1600s from West Texas in the New Mexico area. But now we're seeing that the history goes back to 26,000 years ago. There is a site named the Galt Site on Brushy Creek in northeast of Austin, and there are many other sites like it that date to the Paleo-Indian period and most likely even earlier. What the investigators are finding out at the Galt Site is that the same food preparation practices and the methods of cooking the food has been the same since that long ago up to the historic period. And in the picture that you're seeing here on the screen, our very own Adan Medrano has been able to demonstrate the cooking techniques of Texas Mexican cooking, and he's looking at all of the herbs, and archaeologists are beginning to find some of those herbs in the archaeological record. If we can please advance the slide, please. I mentioned before that there was this trade network. In the 1600s, there was a chief who was a native governor of the people in West Texas. His name was Juan Sabiata. He testified in front of the viceroy. He explained all of the nations, all the way over to East Texas with the Caddo and up in Arkansas. He was basically describing what was called the Tejas Alliance. There were two large commercial network centers, one in the west and one in the east. And this is the quintessential aspect of how we begin to understand our own West Side San Antonio, because San Antonio and Austin in that corridor were on the eastern periphery of the Junta de los Rios. That was the western commercial center. And we were also on the western side of the Rancheria Grande commercial center. And that came and converged in the middle of Texas. What we see here on the slides in the upper left-hand side, you can see how the map that Jose Antonio del Alzarata y Ramirez documented in 1768, Junta de los Rios. And over on the right-hand side, you can see how he describes up in the upper right-hand corner, and then we zoom down to the lower left, you can see the words Rancheria Grande. This is an overall trade network, and we have discovered artifacts at Rancheria Grande that come from all over Texas. And same thing with Junta de los Rios. There are artifacts there that come from all over Texas. So if we could have the next slide, please. In this particular area, it sort of describes what that looked like on a map. The blue line is a Rio Grande. The brown line is the Tejas Alliance. The yellow line is what we know archaeologically of the cultural material assemblages at all of the sites in between. Now, archaeologists have not connected that material culture to the Coahuiltecan people. They call it the Toya phase. Having said that, one of the most important things also is that the blue line is developed by Meredith Schutz in her 1968 research. She went through all of the birth, baptismal records, and marriage records, all of those records from the missions. And basically she discovered that when the Spanish referred to the Naciones Gentiles, they were talking about extended families. And so from that context, we begin to get a better understanding of what the social structure was here. So this is at a point in our conversation where I'm bringing everyone to a point where we're coming to direct contact in 1718. The people here already had indirect contact with the Spanish through the entradas in the 1600s in the west, and as well as De Soto over in the 1500s, 1600s in the east. But here in Texas, that's relevant to us and the west side, direct contact begins in 1718. So if we can have the next slide. For 145 years, the 1573 Ordinances of Discovery, New Settlement, and Peace was the foundation of Spanish laws and regulations regarding the social and political interactions between the Spanish and the Coahuiltecan peoples. And these laws, the stipulations of the laws, were the guiding principles of establishing new villas, missions, and presidios. The prerequisite component for selecting and proposing a new settlement area was the availability of water, food resources, cultivatable land, and most importantly, access through principal roads. Now, when Governor Alarcón noted on April 23rd, 1718, that the road El Camino de la Pita was level and without hills or ravines and with many groves of pecans, he also wrote that many herbs and flowers were on both sides of the road between the Atascosa River and the Medina River. And the next day, the governor noted he followed the same road from the Medina River to the San Antonio River. The priest that was traveling with him, Fray Celis, was demonstrating compliance with one of those most important requirements of 1573 Ordinance under Stipulation 37 and 110, when he said that there was good and principal roads, which would serve to orient the via and main square. And when I say via, I'm talking about the Via de Bejar, San Antonio. Now, Camino de la Pita enters San Antonio from the west side as Presidio Road, which we know later as Commerce Street. This principal road and the stories about it are the fulcrum that balances our understanding of the west side and the city of San Antonio. Next slide, please. The Spanish documented a lot of different things that they were on mapped illustrations. Governor Alarcón acknowledged the Camino de la Pita was based on previous expeditions. In 1716, after crossing the Atascosa River, Captain Ramon noted they traveled through pecan trees, which earlier explorers said that the trees lasted 5 leagues until they reached the Medina River. 5 leagues is 13.5 miles, which is the distance between the two rivers, so we can rely on the accuracy of these journal records. Fray Espinosa noted they came to a pond called Pita because of its spaciousness and the amount of fish and turtles that were there. Fray Espinosa entered into his journal on May 14th some of the legal criteria for selecting the location of a new villa and a mission. So in accordance with the 1573 ordinances, in particular, Fray Espinosa was documenting the conditions that met that particular stipulation. He wrote in his journal, "This river is very desirable for settlement and favorable for its pleasantness, location, abundance of water, and multitude of fish. It is surrounded by very tall nopales, poplars, and elms, and grapevines, black mulberry trees, laurels, strawberry vines, and genuine fan palms. There is a great deal of flax and wild hemp, an abundance of maidenhair fern, and many medicinal herbs. Merely in that part of the density of its grove which we penetrated, 7 streams of water met. Those together with the other concealed by hard brush form a little distance its copious waters, which was crystal clear and sweet." Now, according to stipulation 39, it says, "The site and position of the town should be selected in places where water is nearby and where it would be possible for farming, cultivation, and pasturation." Fray Espinosa had commented on the quality of the environment, which was the selected location of the new settlement. Another priest, Fray Espinosa, made a specific reference to a great deal of flax and that wild hemp, which are both plants that can be dried and woven to make rope and baskets. General Aguirre made the same observation of this specific location on April 21st in 1709, where he commented that an abundance of hemp was noticed in the depressions of the ravines. This was so flourishing that it seemed to be cultivated, though it had received no other care than that of the liberal hand that beautifies everything. Captain Ramon had said the hemp was 9 feet high and the flax was 2 feet high. The presence of 2 types of plants that could be used to weave fishing lines, in addition to maidenhair fern for strong stitching, and many medicinal herbs within depressions of ravines, further supports the concept that the Coahuilteco clans were purposely placing the plants together in this specific area. The Coahuilteco cultural modification of their landscape of agricultural purposes was not the same as European methods, and Fray Espinosa may not have recognized the landscape pattern, but General Aguirre noted that the hemp seemed to be cultivated. Having no other human agency, who could have achieved agricultural methods? General Aguirre attributed the cultivated landscape to the hand of our Lord. Fray Espinosa described the Blue Hole Springs as an area where 7 streams of water met together with others and formed the copious waters, which were clear, crystal, and sweet. General Aguirre also noted the cultivated fields were in the general area of what we know today as the Blue Hole Springs. Now, as researchers, we recognize that the environmental situation of the Olmos Creek Basin and unnamed tributaries match that description, where several streams come together as the Blue Hole, and they form the headwaters of the San Antonio River. On May 16th, Captain Ramon said, "I marched 2 leagues to the northeast through some hills with good pasturage and mesquite trees. We crossed the Salado, although it is not salty. We found on its banks plenty of grapes, and we stopped at its edge." Captain Ramon was documenting the specific requirements regarding the new via and the mission location. According to those 1573 ordinances under stipulation 35, it stated that the new via and the mission, quote, "should be in fertile areas with an abundance of fruits and fields of good land to plant a harvest, of grasslands to grow livestock, of mountains and forests, for wood and building materials for homes and edifices, and good and plentiful water supply for drinking and irrigation." The hills and the good pasturage referred to the mountains and forests for wood and the building materials. When Captain Ramon noted Salado Creek was not salty, as the name suggested, he was documenting the good and plentiful water supply for drinking and irrigation. Likewise, Captain Ramon referenced to his reference to plenty of grapes on the creek banks was his way of quantifying the land had an abundance of fruit. What may seem to be mundane details to early 20th century historians are in actuality to Coahuilteco and Spanish and Tejano descendants a demonstration of our ancestors' purposeful, contemplative, and qualitative compliance with the Spanish laws. Next slide, please. In this particular image, you can see how the Spanish had documented the very beginning of the Villa de Béjar and the types of environment, the trees, the grapevines, and the animals next to the water. And that's very important because in 1716, Captain Ramon said that the same place that the hemp was 9 feet high and the flax was 2 feet high was a reference to an estimate for 12 ultramarines. Another researcher had provided their other interpretation for the term ultramarine in a footnote, and the person stated that the ultramarino referred to individuals from Spain, based on their review of the Diccionario de la Real Academia Española. Now, that person provided the dictionary definition of ultramarine, que está o se considera del otro lado, o a la otra parte del mar. Now, translating one Paleo-Spanish word without the context of its surrounding words hides the author's intent. The literal translation, the definition is that is or is considered on the other side or the other part of the sea. From a Coahuilteco and a Spanish and a Tejano perspective, the term ultramarino means that the expedition's legal requirement was referencing to the potential import, production, and overseas markets in relation to foreign commercial trade. The definition of ultramarino is grocery store, imports, overseas trade, and foreign markets. But when Captain Ramon confirmed in 1709 in his report of the abundant hemp with the addition of flax, maidenhair fern, and the medicinal herbs, all purposely grown together, he was quantifying literally how the Coahuiltecos of the San Antonio River and the Blue Hole area had a plentiful raw source of material for commercial products that met that particular legal requirement. The quantification of 12, it says 12 ultramarinos in the record. That quantification could have been a reference that the hemp was so abundant in terms of 12 unit amounts. In other words, like enough for 12 markets. Captain Ramon described the area as a veritable grocery store of raw resource materials, which could be part of the commercial trade with Spain and what they desired to establish. The presence of two types of plants that could be used to weave fishing line, in addition to the maidenhair fern for strong stitching and the many medicinal herbs within those depressions, was a new Spanish source of vessel rigging, textile production, and pharmacological necessities. The local Coahuilteco Payaya population may have been specializing in the cultivation of these plants as a source material for their production of bartered goods in relation to their well-established trade networks documented by archaeologists. Next slide, please. Now, everything that I was just sharing with you is a description of what the West Side area was like all the way up to the Blue Hole. On this particular image, what we have done in our research is we began to see what was it about the San Antonio area where the Coahuilteco culture met Spanish culture in this direct interaction. What we begin to see is there was an adoption of some of those cultural practices. In particular, one of the things that the Spanish brought with them was a concept of Enlightenment ideology. And when we look at this earliest town plan for San Antonio, in the 1750s, this Plano de la Población de la Villa de Béjar was done by Don José Antonio Villaseñor y Sánchez. We immediately noticed that in this plan, half of it from the plaza over to one edge meets the golden ratio, and on the other side from the same plaza to the west end, that also is a golden ratio and it overlaps. From this map, we were able, if you look in the upper right-hand corner that's in red, that is an overall isometric drawing of what the villa looked like at that time. And then further down on the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a scale. In the lower left-hand side, that particular part of the map describes that there were 2,400 families here. Now, in terms of the 1573 ordinances, when people came here, it was in terms of families, but in the context of how they used to think of it. It was 4 generations. When we see the word families, we have to think of the concept of extended families that are 4 generations. Now, not everybody came out of the total 4 generations, but they had the people, the neighbors, had to be separated by 4 generations to be called a vecino. Otherwise, they were just part of a family. Now, that scale gave us the actual measurements of the overall town plan. And you can see that those numbers right there, we converted them to varas, and that was 1,550 varas by 1,450 varas. If we could have the next slide, please. One of the things that we noticed was that north arrow with the fleur-de-lis symbol over in the bottom left corner. And okay, so here is the next slide of that map that's properly oriented with San Fernando on the west side and the plaza of San Fernando on the east side. The red line indicates that that is the road that was developed a little bit. This is in 1767. This is the José de Urrutia map, and it shows the Presidio de Béjar as well as the Villa de Béjar, as well as El Camino Pita, that was also known, today we know it as the Upper Presidio Road. So we also went ahead and aligned that properly. Go to the next slide, please. So here we see the proper alignment with north, south, east, west. The villa is on the east side, and we see San Fernando, which is right in the middle, over on the west side. But also notice that go further out in what is today the west side. It's in these areas of what the Aguirre and Ramon and Alarcon were talking about, where they saw all the flax and the hemp all the way from here, all the way up basically to the actual area of the Payaya village. And according to the law, the 1573 ordinances, when the Spanish came in here, it promulgated that the Spaniards had to maintain a consultation process to decide where they could put that villa. And so all of this area on the west side had been basically set aside by the Coahuilteco people as their area. So as we advance the slide here, this is a zoomed in image of that Urrutia map overlaid on an aerial, and we can see right in the center on the left hand red arrow, that is the icon for San Fernando, and over the left hand red arrow shows the back end of the church being right there, properly located at the street. Now notice that right behind that is Laredo Street. Laredo Street was the western boundary of the villa in 1776. Everything else west of that street was out of town. So when we go to the next slide, what we did to demonstrate the overall aspect of the golden ratio, you can see right in the center there is San and the two overlapping golden ratio measurements. That particular alignment fits the specific Vada distances that we got off of the Plano de la Población. And all of us have been in San Fernando Cathedral, and in the center there is a brass star. And it's as if the military surveyor that came with Alarcón, it's as if he put his transit level in that spot and surveyed from there all the points of what the via was going to become. Again, now the alignment of the west side is due partly because of on Google Earth, the way it's at an angle, so we didn't have a direct overhead picture, but we get the idea of what that alignment is. Now, if we go to the next slide, we can also see here how the overall town plan fits with Laredo Street right there on the left-hand side, and how everything past that West Laredo Street is now developed, but in the past, those were the areas that was open space between the via and the Payaya villages. And it's also the area where all of the flax and hemp was at. So if we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Once we had verified all of that information in the actual journal records, then we were able to take the other information about other important built environment features like the acequia system. The upper right-hand arrow shows where the water was taken out of the sacred river and channelized to go all the way through and through the Alamo complex, and the desagüe down at the bottom where it went back into the river. We also have on the lowest red arrow one of the other known mission locations. This one happens to be Concepcion, but when the Spanish came in 1718, they negotiated with the elders for 3 areas where they could put missions. Regardless of the name, they were 3 areas. So there was Mission Valero, there was this other area that eventually, Concepcion was put there, and then there was also San Jose. Over the left-hand arrow shows how that was where it comes into the very bottom where the San Pedro Creek is at, showing that that was also in alignment with Laredo Street, and that's everything on the west-hand side. I'm going to go ahead and leave that up so that you all can look at the particular measurements. And at this point, now that we know what the city of San Antonio was like when it was called the Villa de Béjar, what was it like after the missions were secularized? Now, in the historic 19th century, the Westside Tejano communities of Laredito, that has antecedents to the large Payaya village. And General Aguirre documented in his 1709 expedition, 7 years later, on May 14, 1716, Captain Ramon had come through the same area, and he mentioned 2 creeks, which were Apache Creek and Alazan Creek. The general described that particular event as he continued from the Medina River in southern San Antonio and crossed the Apache. I see that I'm at 9:42. Can I continue to go on? That is completely up to you. I have some descriptions of the west side of what it used to look like. Some descriptions of what it was like after the mission period. And so it depends on y'all. Okay, so at that time, Ramon had said that on this day that he had marched northeast 7 leagues, and that's from the Medina River, through the mesquite brushes with plenty of pasturage, and crossing 2 days, he crossed 2 dry creeks, and that was Apache and Alazan, and that they reached the water of the springs on the level land. That was a blue hole, which they named San Pedro. I'm sorry, not a blue hole. They named it San Pedro. there was sufficient water there, and the city was 1/4 league, and the scenery along the San Antonio River was very beautiful, and there were pecan trees and grapevines, willow and elm and other timber. Now, okay, let's go ahead and go to question and answers then.
Oh, okay. Hi, Sergio and Melinda. We have some questions from the audience. The first question is one that's always a popular question, and I know the answer varies on who you ask, but what are the boundaries of the West Side?
So the boundary is basically the eastern boundary historically is San Pedro Creek, which is Laredo Street, and everything west of that was the West Side, but it's also an area that used to be the communal lands for the villa, where the vecinos could graze their cattle. Now that particular area is completely separate from the mission pasture lands. And there are records where they document that the people would routinely collect cattle from that particular area. And so everything that we see right after, and normally we see I-35 as a boundary, but it was really Laredo Street. So all that area was that communal land, but everything by the Guadalupe Theater, all of that is the Payaya village area.
Wonderful. Okay, and that's where I am right now. I'm in the Guadalupe Theater. Another question is there any kind of documentation, written or oral, by indigenous people of this area?
Not written. It's been transcribed by the Spaniards and other travelers. For instance, one of the most important was Captain Zebulon Pike. When he came here in 1806, he was being escorted by the Spanish. He's being escorted out of the Provincia de Tejas, but they stayed here for 10 days in San Antonio. And one of the most important documents, the parts of his record, was his conversation with the priest. And the priest had told him, Pike had asked him what had happened, what had become of the natives. And this is in a report to the United States Congress. And the priest told him they could not exist under the shadow of the Europeans, as the nations who formed these missions had been nurtured and taken all the care of that was possible and put on the same footing as the Spaniards. And that was in accordance with the 1573 ordinances. And afterwards, because as the King of Spain was having more and more foreign advisors come into his court, as well as changing events here in Texas, these were merchant middlemen that lived here before. They saw no profit. In all of the records, they typically are described as having a profit or not having a profit. And so they eventually realized that that wasn't going to be part of their system anymore. So they left and went back to their villas.
Okay. We have two questions about plants, so I tried to combine them. But the question is, are there any surviving original medicinal plants or plants that the indigenous people would have used? And if so, are there books or resources to learn about them, particularly that people are interested in propagating, things like that? And just have a general question about how do we preserve heritage ethnobotany?
So that's a really, really good question. Archaeologically, yes, there is some work that has been done, and we've done some of it out in West Texas, where we've been able to document in the micro faunal and macrofaunal record, that there were particular types of these herbs. We actually found evidence of nopales on one of the microfaunal records. We discovered that there was a great majority of the area was covered in sunflowers. And sunflowers, obviously, they can eat the seeds, but sunflowers also put back into the soil something that the other plants need. Because all plants take nutrients out of the soil, and after a while, you have to leave it fallow. But there's something about sunflowers that puts stuff back into the soil. Now, in terms of books, about what the Coahuiltecos were collecting, not necessarily about them. It would be a great research topic for someone to gather all the information from the archaeological data. But there are plenty of books that describe medicinal uses for the different plants, and it is based on a lot of the memories of some of our ancestors. And of course, we know about the herberias in the West Side, and a lot of that goes back to all of these descriptions.
Okay. And are you there?
Yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay, the other thing is I was thinking of a couple of things, and so in the event, maybe we can put a couple of books. I think maybe there's not one very, very specifically on this topic, but there's some more broadly about this topic that we can help you with. Last question for you two. What is Zavada?
Good question. Vara is a Spanish unit of measure in terms of distance. It translates to 2.63 miles. And so we've been able to convert all the records that discuss varas and understand it in our environment today.
Yeah. Okay, that was wonderful. I know based on the comments, people are really loving this presentation, but we are out of time. So I just want to thank you so much, Sergio and Melinda. Your work is always so impressive, and what an exciting life to be an archaeologist. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Hi, welcome back to the Guadalupe Theater. We have a slight change to the lineup. We're going to go to our architecture panel right now, and then we'll come back with Dr. Gabriela Gonzalez at 11 a.m. Sorry for the change up, but you're going to enjoy this. Thank you. Hello, I want to welcome you to a conversation about
Why can't I hear?
significant architecture of the West Side. We're joined by two local architects who are going to help shed light on just what's so
Do I need to do that again?
No, Sarah.
We're good.
about the architecture of the West Side. First up, we have Stephen Land Tillotson. He was an architect with broad experience in architecture and urban design, historic preservation, and community development issues. He is a partner with Munoz Architects in San Antonio, and he has worked on a variety of award-winning projects. Hello, I want to welcome you to a conversation about significant architecture of the West Side. We're joined by two local architects who are going to help shed light on just what's so special about the architecture of the West Side. First up, we have Stephen Land Tillotson. He was an architect with broad experience in architecture and urban design, historic preservation, and community development issues. He is a partner with Munoz Architects in San Antonio, and he has worked on a variety of award-winning projects throughout Texas, including the San Antonio Convention Center, the restoration of Our Lady of the Lake University's main building, and he's currently working on the San Pedro Creek Improvements Project, as well as the restoration of the historic Robert B. Greene Hospital. He is a community-based design and planning advocate, a past chair of the Urban Affairs Committee of the San Antonio AIA, and past board member of the City South Management Authority. His participation in the Vista Verde South Historic Resource Survey and the Via de Guadalupe Historic Resources Assessment has provided him with a deep comprehension of the architecture of San Antonio's West Side. Next up, we have Elias G Reyna, also known as Lee, who is a San Antonio native who graduated from Burbank High School and then earned a Bachelor of Architecture at Texas A&M University. And then a few years after becoming a registered architect in the state of Texas, he founded Reyna Caragone Architects with the late architect Alexander Caragone. His firm undertook a number of notable projects, including the 1979 Brackenridge Park Rehabilitation Master Plan, the 1982 facade restoration of the Our Lady of Guadalupe Catholic Church. In that same year, he was involved in the Avenida Guadalupe Association Master Development Plan, the Edgewood ISD Master Plan, and then in 1983, he was involved in the Guadalupe Theater restoration, and in 1984, the design of the Collins Garden Library. And in 1985 and 1986, he was involved in the Plaza Guadalupe design phases 1 and 2, along with numerous other projects for a very full career. Lee retired in 2008. Let's start our conversation. Okay, Steve, I'd like to invite you to tell us a bit about the historical context of the architecture of the West Side.
Okay. The architecture of the West Side, the historic context for that, really comes from, really has an origin deeper than the, further back than the actual architectural that's there now. Most of the area of the West Side was really built up, after World War I. And, but there is a context for the West Side that I think is important to understand. And it really, emanates from the original Via de San Fernando, founded by the Canary Islanders in 1731. And, within a generation or two, you started to get the connectivity to Mexico, Laredo, and that road to Laredo on the west side of San Pedro Creek really became kind of the first West Side. As that grew over time, really between the Zarzamora Creek and San Pedro Creek, that was kind of referred to as Little Mexico. You had a great influx of people coming out of Mexico. Certainly the Mexican Revolution had a lot to do with that, but there was a lot of opportunity in San Antonio. So the West Side really comes from that west side of San Pedro Creek, which was the kind of the original divide. And it engendered an architecture that is very different on one side of the creek to the other. And nothing illustrates that better than this Sanborn's map that shows the creek running down from top to bottom, north to south. And on the right-hand side, backing up to the creek and fronting on Flores Street, you see pretty substantial homes, large lots, masonry. These were the 1- and 2-story buildings that the shop owners and really the business people of San Antonio lived in. And on the west side of the creek, you see an entirely different kind of pattern. You see small little shotgun houses, enclaves of tenements, and these were really kind of the vecindades. These were the corrales. These are the places where people could afford to live. And you can see that it made an architecture that is very different than what you'd see on the east side of San Pedro Creek. And as the west side grew, beyond the creek, beyond the railroad tracks, certainly beyond the later Interstate 35, that road, that successor road to Laredo, you've got really several different developments in as the city grew westward. And this was studied some years ago when I worked with Andrew Perez in the Villa de Guadalupe study. And the way that really the west side grew, you could see kind of the subdivision of the lots. You had those large parcels that were bought up by speculators. They were subdivided. Developers came in and subdivided the larger blocks into smaller blocks, and even smaller blocks. You can see from top to bottom on the left-hand side the progression of how all of that open land was parceled and made into lots for the houses that people were building at that time. The map you see on the right-hand side is Sanborn's map of that area around Guadalupe Street in El Paso. The interesting thing is that you just see all these small little houses. These blocks were subdivided into like 12 lots per half block, 24 lots per block, a much higher density than many of the places that you see even now. And when you start to kind of zero in to understand how the lot size, which was really forced by the economy, started to really influence what kind of architecture was built there. As we move in a little bit closer, you can see that the alleys themselves were basically just smaller streets supporting houses on each side. And it wasn't just the houses that really made this a very interesting neighborhood to study, because people really had to be self-sufficient living here. The Hispanics that were moving in from Mexico, expanding out from already settled areas in San Antonio, did not have a lot of money and a lot of means. And so they developed a really wonderful social kind of economy to this whole Villa de Guadalupe area. And when you look at this, yellow is a residence, right? It means it's a wood frame residence, very little masonry, very few large buildings of any kind. And when you look even closer, you can see the kind of disposition and footprint that this housing made. And the vast majority of the architecture is really with the houses themselves, with the residential. Now, this looks all residential, but you'll see D is for dwelling, and all of those dwellings, there's little places where you see an S. That means store. And so to be able to highlight that a little bit better, you can see that of the 60 some odd structures that are taking up just these 2 blocks, there's at least 8 commercial enterprises that are shown highlighted in the red. And those were often attached to a dwelling. They often occupied a corner, which was more strategic in terms of exposure and people being able to access. And so you had just an incredibly diverse and fine-grained density and mix of uses, so that people were actually providing services to their neighbors in these small, close-knit communities. Might be a grocery store, a dry goods store, might be a seamstress, might be a tax accountant, but all of these really provided a lot of infrastructural support in terms of the social system for the Via de Guadalupe. Now that was really kind of supplanted in years later. After World War II, you began to see a different kind of economy. Large grocery store chains began to change all of that. Transportation began to change some of that. And really the age of the buildings themselves, the structures themselves, began to be a detriment. So there was a lot of urban renewal that came in the 1970s and 80s, and that really tore out large patches of this kind of fine-grained character. What was kind of an interesting thing is that it wasn't just individual lots. There were places where there were the kind of collection groupings of smaller homes, which were referred to kind of derogatively as corrales, because they were kind of like a corral. Or there might be a surface privy and a water faucet that was shared among a dozen or so houses. It was not to be over romanticized, but there were also vecindades that were basically clans, kind of family clans. They would have extended family purchase or share another house on the lot. And so you had within these blocks a very high intense use or distribution of homes, and they were very modest. You can see the 2 different vecindades that on the left-hand side there at Colorado Street, and the other at the Guadalupe Street. And then on the right-hand side, you kind of see like a very simple configuration of these kind of shotgun style homes, little cottages. They had different little bit architectural flourishes. There might be a little bit of Victorian, a little bit of bungalow or craftsman style. Very, very minimal types of detailing to give them character. And a lot of these houses were actually just bought at kits that were prefabricated, pre-cut pieces that were sold at lumber yards. And so they're a very efficient way of actually providing a home for a person, for a family. Front porch, you can see a plan on the very top on the right-hand corner. 2, 3 rooms deep, that was it. A place to live, a place to sleep, and a place for cooking. And they were very minimal, but they really served a purpose. Here's some examples of those types of houses. Of course, this is along Guadalupe Street. Just very narrow shotgun houses, and over time, they have, either been torn down or repaired kind of in a delightful way. This is just on Guadalupe, just before you get to Brazos, and on the north side of the street. Just a very simple kind of in its own humble way, elegant type of structure and design. And you see those types of changes in roofscape, little flourishes of detail. Color made its way in a very big way into what are kind of typically kind of little white cottage houses, but the vibrancy of the use and use of color in the West Side is really one of its really distinctive qualities. There were some more kind of traditional Victorian homes out of brick. This particular house with the expressed segmented arches and the corner supports really is one of the few that's there in Villa de Guadalupe, but it certainly has its a kind of a perennial sense of elegance to it, similar to a lot of the houses that you'd see over in King William area. But many of the larger homes, or more a little bit more larger homes, are very much along kind of Victorian craft and bungalow styles. A couple of examples that we're showing here. Now, commercial enterprises are also a significant part of the fabric, of the architectural fabric. Again, very, very modest, but with some stylistic kind of flourishes to them and relations. This kind of Spanish colonial, this with a curvilinear express parapet, now stuccoed, was originally framed, and it has a dwelling that's attached to the back of it. It was operated as a store, and the store owners lived immediately next to it. And again, another example of actually one of the store residences, this wonderful complex with its two-story board and batten, cantilevered gallery on the second floor and canopy, is a very wonderful example of a very simple, straightforward, commercial, residential building. And there were a number of these. There's not as many as there used to be. A lot of these have been torn down over the years, but this is certainly one of the really wonderful remaining examples. Also, early 20th century commercial buildings out of brick, very simply detailed. This commercial building with its corner chamfer, also attached to what used to be the old Botanica next to it. This also is an example of the type of succession and growth and modifications over time. It's a shame that it's not in use and not restored, but it is still part of the fabric of the historic architecture. And again, very simple storefronts along the more heavily traveled the commercial streets. And then over time, many of these have been really just kind of reinterpreted. This is one of my favorites. This just the robust and improvisational use of Mr. P's burger place here is just incredible. The incorporating, really kind of folk art, different craft, planting, religious symbols. It is just a wonderful collage of cultural content and material and color. And then there's the really kind of the stately architecture that are the set pieces of Villa de Guadalupe on the west side. And certainly the Guadalupe Church in its Romanesque revival style, done with Behannes brick, which just comes from west of San Antonio. Really one of the most elegant Romanesque style buildings in San Antonio, and certainly has been a center for the community for many, many years. This is really one of the best examples of really the kind of the higher architecture, the high architecture of the neighborhood. It also has Spanish colonial churches in the style, yeah, the Prima Iglesia Cristiana church. Again, kind of a more inventive Spanish colonial, but it's really kind of a deco colonial, incorporating some classical details on it as well. And this kind of a more eclectic style you will see popping up every now and then. Again, kind of this colonial, the Progresso Theater, which has been rehabilitated as a meeting place. This was had a lot of polychrome color originally, but the details are in that kind of colonial revival mode, and it certainly adds to the reinforces that architectural fabric. And the Inman Center, of course, it's a two-story brick building. Not a lot of flourishes to it, but certainly one of the set pieces in terms of the social focus in the neighborhood. The old Progresso drugstore and the Guadalupe Theater are really kind of the icons of this whole neighborhood. The Progresso drugstore, with its incorporation of polychrome, glazed tile, glass block, the actual set scenes that the panoramas that are incorporated into the second story there, has a wonderful lighting canopy. Just one of the most interesting and exuberant buildings we have in San Antonio. And of course, the Guadalupe Theater right across the street from it, with its references to that Spanish Renaissance, but incorporating the Deco marquee tower. Just truly unique and distinctive for San Antonio, for this neighborhood. And that kind of walks you through the architectural character that was there historically. The wonderful thing about this is that this type of architecture is still going on. It is not yet historic because it's only been in the last 4 decades or so since Lee and other architects have worked on the West Side and been inspired by the historic architecture that's there to actually kind of reinvent and reconstitute the architectural character for that West Side.
Hello, Sarah and Steve. Thank you so much, Steve, for all the background of the West Side architecture. My presentation today includes the 3 projects that Reyna Carrigot did back in the early 80s, really a very short period between 1981, 82 to 86. And the 3 projects I'm going to be presenting today is the Guadalupe Theater, the Plaza Guadalupe, and Collins Garden Library. The theater was developed back in 1942 by the Lucchese family, which owned a number of Spanish language theaters in San Antonio, including the Alameda and Nacional. The architect for these theaters was N. Strauss Nafak, which I believe was also involved with the Apache courts. So he was quite prominent back in those days. The Guadalupe Theater project, as I mentioned, began around 1980, 81, and some of the players of that project included the city council, the mayor at that time was Cisneros, Henry Cisneros, and the city councilman from that district was Bernardo Veste, and the board member, I want to mention a board member to the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center was Rolando Rios. And there is a photograph later on in the slide presentation that you'll see us all together, including Alex and myself, when the theater was about to begin the process to redevelop. So our program included, or we determined that pretty much the structure was sound, and but it just needed upgrading and gutting. The building had over the years been, in the 40s, was a vaudeville and film facility, which declined in the 50s, and then in the 60s, it became a flea market. And so when we walked into this facility in 81, something like that. It's been so long, I forget some of these years, but anyhow, it was pretty bad shape. The seating was in a bad state of water damage and the whole place. So we basically decided it was a restoration project and gutted the building. And the city, with a private developer, funded the project, and this was in 1982, and in 83 it was opened. Part of the plan program for the restoration included discussions with the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center at the time, and it was determined that taking out the raked floor with the seating, of course, and installing flexible platforms would be a better use of make the theater space, the auditorium space, into a multi-use space. And so we went ahead and did that. You might go to the first slide. Here you have, of course, the exterior of the project, which we continued to use the Talavera tile that was part of the structure and expanded it into the wainscot and into both elevations of the Guadalupe and the Brazil Street elevations. This was a new element in the auditorium space. As you entered from the lobby into the auditorium space, this wall did not exist. We added this wall and became an anti-foyer into the terraced platform seating that took place in the auditorium space. The one thing that we did keep were these faux balconies along the walls of the auditorium space. The other thing, of course, was enlarge the stage and enlarge fly space to the stage area. Building received new systems, new building systems, new electrical, new plumbing, air conditioning, and the lobby was restored. The whole building was restored. On the exterior, of course, we restored the marquee and the neon tower and the Guadalupe letters. All that was restored. So basically, the building took on a whole new character to it. You can move on to the interior slide of the, go to the next one. This is the interior of the auditorium seating, which you see the terraced platforms and the multi-stacked chairs that were in place at the time when we completed the project. On the side, you can see a little bit of the faux balconies that part of the design of the interior. I will mention that the design of this included, of course, myself and Alex and Michael Schrader, who certainly was a very talented architect and was part of our firm at the time. This is, of course, the photograph of the people involved that I mentioned earlier, with Bernardo Modeste on the right, Alex and myself in the middle, and Rolando Rios on the left. Rolando Rios was a board member and attorney at the time, board member of the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. An exterior of the night scene lighting of the Guadalupe. The project did receive in 1984 a Preservation Award by the Conservation Society, Sanitary Conservation Society. Yeah, I'm showing this El Progreso drugstore as part of the materials and services and that influence a big part of what we did on the two projects on the Guadalupe Plaza and the theater. Now we go into the Plaza Guadalupe. In 1979, this is an aerial perspective drawing of the plaza. You see the church at the top, and with a circular dandy that took place, or partially took place, that we call Plaza Jardín. And then Guadalupe Street is at the bottom of the drawing. But I first want to talk about the players in this project. Of course, these projects in this neighborhood were really, really difficult. And so you had to have some very strong people behind them. A number of local merchants and business people in the Guadalupe area formed the Avenida Guadalupe Association in 1979. And some of the key players were the Father Ed Salazar from the Guadalupe Church and an attorney, Gilbert Vasquez, along with Rudy Davila, who owned the medical building at the corner of San Jacinto and Guadalupe. The plan came about the same time that the Teatro Guadalupe began to take place in terms of the Guadalupe Theater started construction while we were planning and designing this project. Of course, some of the things that happened, the planning that took place here included a historical survey, which was done by Martha Doty Freeman, and an archaeological study that was done by Ann Fox, and a market analysis of a larger area besides just this one block, a much larger area by Dr. Rectangle. All this information was utilized as part of our planning to the development of this plan. One of the central things ideas that was being expressed back then was the relationship that happens in European open spaces, Mexican open spaces where you have a church and a park across the way as a community space, a social community space. So the idea of having a plaza at this location was central to the whole plan. And so we began to call it Plaza Cultural. Many of the things that influence the project were these influences of church, the social life, the religious life that happens as part of the church. This I show as part of the footprint of the block that's bounded by El Paso, Guadalupe, Brazos, and San Jacinto Street. We envisioned on the right side of the plaza, the circular plaza, to be infilled by the Arts Center, facilities that the Arts Center would be part of. And on the left side, possibility of shops and of course the medical center. So, you know, you could have coffee shops, galleries, and so on to activate the plaza. Here you see the references of the use of Talavera tile. We had a pink and violet Talavera tile that was cladded the facade of the Guadalupe facade. These are all, of course, these portals become part of the idea of entering a public space. The gabled entry is all part of what was part of the neighborhood, and you see in some of all the vernacular, the shotgun houses, et cetera, that go on. But this also was interpreted by many architects as well, that this was the use of postmodern design. This is the arcade, the main pavilion arcade, and you can see the Guadalupe Church beyond. This is another view from the main arcade looking back towards Guadalupe Street. The left side of this space happened as was constructed under phase 2, so that phase 1 really partially stopped before this phase 2 that took place, and so this completed the open public space. Phase 2, where you see the circular wall, continued on to make a porch, which was to receive an office building behind that. Well, a building was done there, but the building faced away. It's supposed to open into the plaza. A newspaper clipping that shows us receiving a design award. Yeah, this is a view of the library, Pons Garden Library, through a gateway kind of structure that was done. This is a model, and of course you see here the three roof structures that define what goes on inside. But the newspaper clipping of these projects in the West Side would have never taken place without someone like Cops. For 8 years, I understand, fought for getting this project done at the city. Here you see the entrance, and one of the several significant things about this project. One was that it was the first solar-powered facility for the city of San Antonio. And the other was that it was the first city project that was also a postmodern design. This articulated entry, of course, has this gabled entry, which is how postmodern design happens very often. And the articulated entry there was an open entry, the glass wall below at ground level. You passed through a gate at that point, and then it was still open. So the structure up above it was an open structure, so that it would still provide shade for the space. But as you entered the front doors, the influences here had to do with the two buildings on either side of this. This is built on a very narrow esplanade, but to the left side was an HEB, which had the glass block entry and some lighted neon. On the right side was a Methodist church that had a high pitch to it. So we, in this project, used the same roof pitch that the church had. Now, this is 2020. What is missing here? The whole front cupola and facade, the articulated facade, the whole entry open space that was kind of an atrium space is missing. This is another newspaper clipping from the time where
Okay, thank you so much. Steve, could you just explain a little bit about the Via de Guadalupe survey? What was the purpose of that survey?
Yes, well, the survey is an inventory, of this particular area. That whole area in there was part of the San Antonio redevelopment agency's interest in getting redevelopment dollars, HUD money, to basically go and try and rehabilitate the neighborhood. I think that the impact of that survey was to some degree helpful in saving a lot of the historic fabric in through there, but in other cases it was not, unfortunately. I think one of the things that I emphasized in my previous discussion was just the kind of the diversity of uses and the density. And what many of those redevelopment funds did actually for the residential component of it was to raise entire blocks where there were 40, 50, dwellings, and put back like 8 or 12 houses. nicer houses, 2-3 bedroom homes, larger lots. But in that kind of de-densification, which was at the time seen as a positive thing, well-intended, all those little stores that people had that were attached to their houses, they couldn't survive on a reduced population of customers, basically. And so that to me, that was an unfortunate outcome on that. But there was some really important infrastructure that was rebuilt with that whole effort: streets, sidewalks, sewer and water. All of those improvements were really essential. And there was some money put into, really economic redevelopment. And so the market and some of the other things that you see there, were also really just helped by that whole process.
At the Plaza Guadalupe, we had a gentleman that actually was employed by me, Ernesto Olivares, who was a planner from, graduated from MIT, wonderful man, charismatic. Unfortunately, he died in a tragic highway accident in Mexico, so we lost him. But during the time that he worked with me and Alex in the development of the plaza, he went on to become the executive director for the Avenida Guadalupe Association. He would have made things much, much different had he been around. So, again, it's individuals that make some of these things happen. Just like the thing I was going to mention about the plaza is activity doesn't happen like it should be happening. And that's because of the loss of things that didn't take place there. And as a consequence, now the place has this fence around it, and it's a new modern fence kind of design that was recently installed. But you also see across from the Guadalupe Church on El Paso Street a chain link gate that still remains in the evenings and on weekends. So it's to keep people out. I mean, it's supposed to be a public space. So yeah, what do you do? The other thing, of course, is that the Collins Garden Library, how that's been altered. It's just unbelievable what happened there.
Well, I did want to say that Lee and Alex's work on the plaza, was a game changer. It really was the right project at the right time. It fit in with the spirit of the architecture that you see in the Progressive Drugstore and in the Guadalupe Theater. It was very ambitious, and really was the success of it was predicated on really the way the buildings would plug into it. And Lee brought up the point that the first building, substantial building, just basically turns back on the public space there. And it's those kinds of things that are critical, because that kind of exposure, that kind of passive surveillance that you have from open windows and doors and people kind of going in and out, that's what gives security to public spaces. And so, yeah, building turns back, and then people congregate around, and it's not safe. And so then they put up a fence to keep people out. So it's those kinds of just the nuances of how public space really has to be activated and secured through activity. And for the historic district that's really being discussed now, what you start doing with open spaces and social space and sensitive redevelopment in critical areas to bring back some economic development, and bring back positive activity, into that historic district, really has to be thought out. You can't leave it up to chance. and there has to be really better planning on the city's part, and not just planning, but actual urban design, where you get to the details and you can begin to create design criteria and really goals that need to be met and substantiated by that kind of redevelopment. I think that the lesson would be exactly that those public spaces and social spaces need to be architecturally sensitive, but they also have to be socially smart and economically well conceived.
When it's time for me to speak, can you like give me a
Hello,
hi, Lee?
how you doing?
I'm okay. And this is Natalie?
Natalie, good to see you.
Okay, welcome back. Thank you so much. I do have to share that unfortunately Stephen is having technology issues. I think we can all relate, we can all sympathize. So he's not going to be able to join us for the Q&A, unfortunately. But certainly questions that were targeted towards him, if at some point we can get those answers, we can plug those into the chat later. But we do have Lee Reyna here with us, and we of course have a bunch of questions. Up first, a question about the Guadalupe Theater. So this is a good one for you, Lee. People are curious, are there photos of the Guadalupe Theater before the rehabilitation?
No, unfortunately. It was one of the things that I'm sure we thought of, but somehow I don't recall us doing that.
Yeah, and you know, it's possible, I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there might, I want to say there might be some exterior shots in ITC's collection, the Institute of Texts and Cultures, through UTSA.
Okay.
And I do recall at least a newspaper article about the grand opening back in the 40s, and I want to say there was an image, but the image might have been an illustration, because a lot of times in the 40s in the paper it was an illustration as opposed to a photo. But maybe even the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center has something, so we'll have to find out. But thank you for that question. And now we have some questions about the Guadalupe Plaza. One person has a question. Well, I don't know if this is a question or a statement, but the concern is that the fence doesn't allow a relationship between the Our Lady of Guadalupe shrine and the plaza. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Lee. But then just as a follow-up question, somebody just wants to know, why is the fence there?
Supposedly, yeah. My conversations with the current director of the Avenida Guadalupe Association concerns drug use in the area by locals, and so that's, you know, the what they're dealing with. But certainly, if it was more things going on there, some of that activity wouldn't be taking place. So yeah, it's a lot of people have seen that, and they had concerns with the chain link fence over which was completely surrounding the whole plaza for over a year. And recently a new designed fence was installed, but there's still a chain link gate at the north side of the plaza, facing the church. But so that's, it's just, why? It's gotta stop. They've got to understand that place is supposed to be open. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. And then some other people were just sharing memories of activity Plaza over the years, and I just want to acknowledge that. We also have a question about, well, what happened to the original facade of the Collins Garden Library? And Lee, I have to apologize. I know when we did the panel, you actually explained this, and just because I had to edit for time, the answer to that got cut off. So maybe you could just explain what happened.
Well, yeah, there was the project included this three-part design and is expressed on the roof. And the first part was this entry space that was open, partially open to the sky, but partially roofed, which was this articulated cupola. And that's all removed recently, I suppose. I just, as part of this program, I took this photograph that showed that whole cupola entry space was gone, and it now accommodates an office space for the council person in District 5, and certainly materially changed the whole entry to the building, because it's some sliding aluminum modern doors. The glass block was removed, which was a curved entrance on the ground floor. So over the years, there's been updates. As I forgot to mention that the solar power element of that design was something that Bill Sinkin way back in those days was promoting, and the city saw fit to do it in this project. And we had two gentlemen out of Trinity University that had a system that was applied in this project. It was wonderful for the winter time, but the summer function did not work, and or did not work as well as what was required for our temperatures here in this area. So over the years, of course, it was updated, it was replaced, that it was a passive solar system that was initially installed and later replaced with the typical AC systems that we see everywhere now. And there were some upgrades in the restrooms. And so that was all certainly, something that we saw as perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. But this latest change was just, something that was very difficult. Given that it was this project was the first postmodern building that was done by the city of San Antonio, and in terms of the architecture, and other things that related. The HEB across the street had a glazed block like we had on the building, and it had the glass block, the glazed block, and it was interesting because the HEB new building has all the old references or the old materials that they left. The historic wall that was part of the old HEB is there. And here we have our library that's kind of materially changed at the front entry. So,
that brings up an interesting point, is that typically buildings that are over 50 years old qualify for historic designation and then some kind of protection for the design. But buildings that are younger than that have no protection. And so I know right now there's a lot of debate about these mid-century modern buildings that are now just entering the 50 years old phase, like brutalist architecture and things like that. And if we don't appreciate those postmodern things that came in the 80s, maybe early 90s, they won't be around in 50 years to designate historic,
Correct.
right?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's good.
Okay. We have one more question, and this was about somebody is looking for a written history of the evolution of the West Side and its architecture. And if you don't have an answer to that, I can help out.
No, I don't.
Okay, I'm going to make two recommendations. The first recommendation is anything by Daniel Arriola. I just love his work. He's a cultural geographer out of, well, now he lives in New Mexico. He's retired, but he was he was in Arizona for many, many years. He has a fantastic book called, I wrote it down, Tejano, South Texas, which is an edited, I'm sorry, it's a whole volume focusing on the built environment and cultural landscape of South Texas, from San Antonio down to the Valley. So he has some really great sections on San Antonio in there. But if you don't want to read a whole book, there's also a standalone article that he wrote called Mexican American Housescapes. And it is about sort of the built environment that Mexican Americans have built. And he actually focuses in on San Antonio's West Side for that essay. And then, shameless plug, in December of this year, Texas A&M Press is publishing an edited volume called A Field Guide to the Vernacular Buildings of San Antonio. And I have an essay in there on West Side architecture. So that'll be out in a couple of months.
Great
Okay.
stuff. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah.
Well, and thank you. I think that covers the questions that we received. And again, I'm sorry that Steve couldn't make it for the Q&A, but you know how it is right now. We're all figuring these technology out. So it's no big deal, Stephen, if you're watching this from home. We'll catch you another time, okay? We will be right back with Dr. Gabriela Gonzalez. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I can. Okay. Let me get a drink. Okay, I'm ready. Okay, I can start. Okay, hello everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Dr. Gabriela Gonzalez. I'm an associate professor at the University of Texas at San Antonio. First off, I would like to thank Sarah Gould for inviting me to participate in the Westside History Symposium. My special thanks to the sponsors, the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center, the Westside Alliance Preservation, and also the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. Thank you so very much. Okay, so today's presentation is Emma Tenayuca and Carolina Munguía, the politics of benevolence and radical reform. Emma Tenayuca and Carolina Munguía served the San Antonio Mexican immigrant and Mexican American communities during the 1930s. These contemporary activists approached their work in different ways, and that is the subject of my presentation. Tenayuca served her community as a radical reformer seeking social and economic transformation in her quest for justice, while Munguía used the politics of benevolence to achieve her goals of social uplift and cultural redemption. Before I say anything further about these activists, I have a few slides I would like to show you on San Antonio during the 1930s. And these are images of the world that these women witnessed, which in large part helps to explain what motivated them to become involved. Next, please. Okay, so two major problems plagued the Mexican origin community in San Antonio. One of those problems was racism. And let me read you the caption for this slide so you can get more information. Signs refusing Mexicans admittance to public establishments were common throughout the state of Texas. This one was painted on the wall of a restaurant in San Antonio around 1935-36. And you could find signs like this actually in various communities throughout the state of Texas. So definitely Texas was one of the southern states that had these signs, but of course there were others, unfortunately. Next slide. Poverty was another major issue, with attendant evils of malnutrition, poor housing. All right, so in the first image, and it's I've labeled it number 1. That is a picture depicting the Guadalupe Church distributing food for people, such as a loaf of bread, a bag of beans. The second image, number 2, Mexican Pecan Workers Union official displaying relief supplies, which were supposed to feed a family of 3 for 2 weeks. The articles that this man is holding up include beans and butter. And the third image is one of a relief line, people waiting for commodities. And these images are, they come from the Library of Congress, from the National Archives. So you can access these, those of you who are interested in doing research about these time periods. These kinds of images are readily available. Next slide, please. Poverty meant overcrowding. Here we're looking at, and by the way, these descriptions come from the people who took the photos and collected this data in the 1930s. So the caption for this one states, a typical pecan sheller's family, 11 of a family of 15 living in a 2-room house, 3 beds in living room and 1 in kitchen, again from the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Next. Unsanitary conditions. Okay, and there you have some images to get an understanding. A lot of times the Westside community was the last in town to get services. So a lot of people had to put up with substandard situations like this. Okay, next, please. A lack of medical care. Here we're looking at a father who was suffering from kidney problems and had no medical attention. The family was on relief. Next. There was also a high infant mortality rate among ethnic Mexicans in San Antonio. This is a hearse that was used for funerals of Mexican babies. Next. All right. Number one, homes in San Antonio's west side. You know, you had shanties. Number two, Mr. and Mrs. Medina in front of their 6 by 12 foot shack. Mrs. Medina would not pose until she had pinned on her CIO button. They were both pecan shellers. Okay, so they took special pride in being part of this labor union. Number three, each doorway represents a home. In many instances, 8 or more persons occupied these homes, which consisted of 2 small rooms. And number 4, this photo shows some of the better homes where the unemployed pecan shellers lived. These houses rented for $1 per week. Next. So these were the homes in which Mexican American and Mexican immigrant women cooked, laundered, cleaned, raised their children, and raised gardens. Okay, next. Okay, and this is an image from 1929. LULAC was founded by the merging of 4 organizations: the Corpus Christi Council of the Sons of America, the Alice Council of the Sons of America, and the Knights of America, and the Latin American Citizens League in the Rio Grande Valley and Laredo. And I have this image here to remind us that in addition to labor unions who were working very hard to gain some measure of fairness for the workers in terms of working conditions and the payment they received, there were also civil rights, human rights organizations that had been developing, and LULAC, which is still around today, was one of the preeminent ones in 1929, founded in Texas, working to address the fact that Jim Crow had become widespread, or Juan Crow, Jaime Crow. In the literature on Mexican American history, you see different terminology, but it really is a reference to this common phenomena of the development of a white supremacist apartheid system in various parts of the American South. Okay, next, please. Here is an image of Emma Tenayuca. Emma Tenayuca standing on the steps of the San Antonio City Hall with fist raised. She is surrounded by people with banners. The date I have for that is 1938. All right, Emma Tenayuca was a labor organizer, community activist, and school teacher born in San Antonio, Texas on December 21st, 1916. She was the first daughter born to Sam Tenayuca and Benita Hernandez Cepeda. Her parents had 11 children, and to relieve their economic burden, the maternal grandparents raised some of the children, including Emma. So she spent a lot of time with her grandparents. Her grandfather worked as a carpenter, and he followed politics closely. Tenayuca developed an early understanding of transnational politics when, at the age of 7, she was taken to the Plaza del Zacate, the public square, on Sunday outings. There she would listen to magonistas and anarcho-syndicalists who sought to address the issues of relevance to working class families on both sides of the border. And there were other speakers too, because keep in mind that Mexico was going through its own process of trying to effect more democratic reforms. And so there was always somebody in San Antonio, always somebody in town from this or that political party or faction. And Emma Tenayuca was getting very important lessons about politics early on. While a student at Brackenridge High School in Depression era San Antonio, she joined a group that read the works of Karl Marx and Leo Tolstoy and others. And the students would discuss various important, weighty topics of the time period, including the vulnerabilities of the free enterprise system. Keep in mind, the students are dealing with 1930s depression issues in the aftermath of the stock market crash and everything else. Tenayuca did not confine herself to intellectual ponderings. In 1933, she joined the Think Cigar Strike. Next, please. She participated in the picket line and was arrested. She sympathized with the female labor force of the Think Cigar Company, especially because neither the local machine-run government nor the Catholic Church seemed to care about the workers at this point. Sheriff Albert West worked to defeat the strike. He did this by arresting strikers and threatening them with violence. In 1936, Tenayuca joined the Communist Party. Led by Earl Browder, the Communist Party of the 1930s pursued a popular front strategy meant to mainstream the party into American political life. Proponents of the Popular Front favored the socialistic aspects of New Deal liberalism, and they supported President Franklin D. Roosevelt's efforts to reform and regulate business and to create an economic safety net for Americans. Tenayuca also organized workers. By 1937, she served as executive secretary for 10 chapters of the Workers' Alliance of America, a national federation spearheading the movement to assist the unemployed. One critical project that the Workers' Alliance supported was the pecan sheller strike of 1938. During the 1930s, the nation's pecan production was centered in San Antonio. Although the industry had mechanized, it reverted back to hand labor because of the abundance of cheap labor in Texas. Mexicans worked in crowded spaces with inadequate sanitary facilities, poor ventilation and illumination, and with the brown dust from the pecans hanging heavy in the air. Wages in this female-dominated industry stood at $2.73 a week per worker. Next, please. In January 1938, these meager wages were cut, sparking a strike involving thousands of workers, members of the International Pecan Shellers Union number 172, which was affiliated with the United Cannery and Agricultural Packing and Allied Workers of America, known as UCAPAWA, a Congress of Industrial Organizations Union. Okay, and before I go on, I just want to highlight one of these images right here on the lower right-hand side. That is the young woman or girl, that's María del Refugio Osuna, age 13, and Mrs. San Juan González, age 77. Okay, they were pecan shellers, 1938. And so that's one of the interesting things and sad things about this situation, is that a lot of times children and grandchildren would follow their relatives into these industries, these very low wage exploitative industries. So Emma Tenayuca and others were very cognizant of the inherited nature of poverty, how difficult it was to break out of these systems. Okay, the CIO supported UCAPAWA and worked with other groups, including the Workers' Alliance. Through this linkage, Emma Tenayuca got involved in the strike, and she emerged as a leader of striking workers. Keep in mind that Emma Tenayuca was very talented, incredibly intelligent, very articulate, charismatic. She drew crowds to her. People loved her. So it's not surprising that she emerges as a labor leader. And she worked very hard, of course, on their behalf. The 3-month-long strike resulted in the arrest of over 1,000 picketers, some of whom were tear gassed by the police and fire departments who were on, quote, riot duty. Next image, please. Okay, then there you can see the strikers, CIO. Okay, next. Emma Tenayuca herself was arrested, along with many others, as I just stated. The gross mistreatment of strikers led the Industrial Commission of Texas to investigate violence. Commission hearings determined that the police department had overstepped its authority. Mayor C.K. Quinn, Police Chief Kilday, city officials, and the National Catholic Welfare Council maintained that the strike was communist inspired, and according to them, therefore, that made it illegitimate. Keep in mind that there was very strong, even before World War II, there was very strong anti-socialism, anti-communism sentiment on the far right, and it would make its way into mainstream thought. And so it was very difficult for people who were left of center to communicate their messages of social justice, because they would be, the term that is used often to describe this process is being red baited, and trying to silence these cries for social justice by associating activists with Russia, later the Soviet Union, and with revolution and instability and so on. So it was very difficult. Given her Communist Party affiliation, Emma Tenayuca became an easy target, and soon Yucapahua pressured Tenayuca to step down as a leader. Donald Henderson, president of Yucapahua, took over the strike with advice from Luisa Moreno, a CIO leader. This new leadership, which included George Lambert, the Yucapahua representative in San Antonio, negotiated the strike settlement, securing higher wages for workers. Unwilling to pay higher wages in the future, the industry reverted back to mechanization, thus eliminating thousands of jobs in the process. Next slide, please. In 1939, Emma Tenayuca, by then the chairperson of the Texas Communist Party, was scheduled to speak at a Communist Party meeting in the municipal auditorium. The Ku Klux Klan, the Texas Pioneers, the Elks, veterans organizations, and the Catholic Church condemned San Antonio Mayor Maury Maverick and demanded that the mayor rescind the permit. The mayor refused to do this. On the evening of August 25th, some 150 Communist Party members tried to conduct their meeting as thousands protested outside. When the crowd heard the Communist Party members singing the Star-Spangled Banner, the crowd outside went wild, hurling rocks and bricks at the building. Inside, police officers guided Communist Party members through a tunnel extending from the auditorium to the San Antonio River. They got out just in time, for the crowd broke through the police barrier and vandalized the curtains and the seats in this municipal auditorium. So it became known as the Municipal Auditorium Riot, and essentially it ended the political career of Maury Maverick, who was actually burned in effigy at City Hall by angry San Antonians. Tenayuca's public life also came to a screeching halt. She received death threats and found it impossible to secure employment in town. Essentially, she was blacklisted by the local business community. So she ends up moving out of town, and she also divorces her husband in the early 1940s, Homer Brooks. They had married in 1937. He was a member of the Communist Party who at one point ran for governor representing the Communist Party. The couple had no children. So she leaves San Antonio. She spent some time also in California, and she gets educated over there. She earned a bachelor's degree, for example, from San Francisco State University, and she became a reading teacher. In 1968, she returned to San Antonio, and she earned a master's degree from Our Lady of the Lake University. but she never returned to labor organizing, to formal labor organizing. Of course, she kept abreast of issues. She collected newspaper clippings, and she very much remained engaged in the events of the day, but she essentially became a private citizen. She retired from school teaching in 1982. During the last decades of her life, she became popular among Chicana and Chicano activists and scholars who found inspiration in her previous work. For example, if you visit her archives, you're going to find a lot of letters, correspondence cards from activists, scholars, politicians who were seeking her advice on an array of issues and projects. Emma Tenayuca died on July 23rd, 1999, receiving many tributes from the city that had once shunned her, or at least a part of the city that had shunned her. And right here, we are looking at images from the municipal auditorium. That's Emma Tenayuca, her husband at the time, Homer Brooks, and Elizabeth Benson attempting to hold a Communist Party meeting before the riot broke out August 25th, 1939. Next image, please. And the wedding photograph of Emma Tenayuca. Some of these images are available at the UT Institute of Texan Cultures for those of you interested in research or for your students. So this one was originally published in the San Antonio Light. Next image, please. Okay, so we're going to turn our attention now to Carolina Munguía, Carolina Malpica de Munguía. Carolina Munguía was a teacher, community organizer, and radio personality. Carolina was born to Patricio Malpica and his wife on January 14th, 1891 in Puebla, Mexico. Although Catholic, she was educated at the Instituto Normal Metodista. She acquired her teaching credentials in 1911 and did graduate work in English. Malpica combined her educational influences with Mexican cultural nationalism. She became a successful teacher and administrator, serving as principal at the Methodist school in Orizaba. After her marriage to José Rómulo Munguía Torres in 1916, she left her career. The couple had 7 children. Rómulo Munguía's political involvement during the Mexican Revolution eventually led to the family's exile by the mid-1920s. Next image, please. During the Great Depression, Carolina Munguía helped her husband open a print shop in San Antonio, Texas. And when money was tight, she contributed to the family economy by taking in washing and shelling pecans at home. These were temporary measures because Munguía Printers overall was quite successful. In fact, it was in the news a few years ago because it was closing after 73 years of service to the San Antonio community. In San Antonio, Texas, Munguía, by now a mother of 4, immersed herself in community activism designed to address the problems of poverty and racism faced by Mexican origin people. During the late 1920s, she taught classes at the Wesleyan Institute, and in 1932, she created a Spanish language radio program, La Estrella, on Cono. Through this program, Munguía promoted Mexican culture, especially music and literature. In 1937, she served as secretary of the Crockett Latin American Parent Teachers Association. Next, please. The following year, she served as president. This organization sought to improve the educational experiences of Mexican origin school children by getting their mothers involved in the Spanish-speaking PTA and working to promote cordial relations with European Americans. Next image, please. This is an image of many of these children were the children of pecan shellers. So she was trying to help improve their experiences in school and trying to get the mothers involved. And she worked with LULAC on this, the creation of Spanish-speaking PTAs to make the American educational system accessible to parents, in particular to mothers, so that they could be involved in their children's education. Next image, please. Here you have Carolina Munguía. As I stated, she was very much involved in the Spanish-speaking PTA. So here she is with other members. Next image. And she got the school principal invested in the Spanish-speaking PTA. He became a supporter of it as well. So she was trying to be a bridge with European Americans who were essentially not white supremacists, but wanted to work with ethnic Mexicans, wanted to do their jobs as school teachers and administrators. So she was always on the lookout for potential allies and trying to be a bridge builder. Also in 1938, she participated in literacy work and assisted the Mexican consulate with the Asociación de la Biblioteca Mexicana. On June 12, 1938, Munguía, influenced by the Council General of Mexico, formed a female voluntary association designed to, as she put it, quote, socially and culturally uplift less fortunate Mexican origin women. Under the slogan of Todo por la Patria y el Hogar, all for country and home, Munguía founded the Círculo Social Femenino México as a vehicle for cultural redemption and female benevolence. It was later renamed Círculo Cultural Isabel la Católica. Munguía's goal of culturally redeeming the members of Círculo Cultural was carried out through cultural negotiation and cultural nationalism. As their cultural negotiator, she worked to help the women adapt to a foreign world. For example, she secured the services of 2 Mexican origin lawyers so that the women would have someone to turn to for questions regarding US laws. And she served as the contact point between the club and the Anglo-American community. She also informed them of educational opportunities such as free sewing classes, free English language classes. While cultural negotiation benefited members by expanding their social links and resources, cultural nationalism was about promoting Mexican ethnicity, specifically a sense of ethnic pride and unity among La Raza, the Mexican origin community. Ethnic pride took various forms. For example, all minutes and correspondence of her organization were written in Spanish. The society's theme song was the Mixteca, a very popular song expressing feelings of sorrow brought on by life away from Mexico. Munguía periodically delivered talks on Mexican-related issues, and the Fiestas Patrias, the 5 de Mayo, 16 de Septiembre, were observed regularly. The second component of Carolina Munguía's quest for community uplift was female benevolence. She believed that, quote, as women, wives, and Mexicans, members were in an excellent position to uplift families and communities. This conviction guided Munguía throughout her activist career. Círculo Cultural disbanded in late 1939, but Munguía continued with her community work. In 1940 and 1941, Munguía headed the Spanish-speaking department of the council in District 5 for San Antonio's PTA meetings at Crockett. She also organized a PTA chapter at T.J. Breckenridge School. The significance of Munguía's community activism was that it reflected a transnationalist perspective where borders were respected as political creations, but culture transcended national boundaries. She sought to conserve a Mexican cultural heritage, even as she helped Mexicans in the United States adapt to American ways. By 1944, Carolina Munguía and her husband Romulo had taken this transnationalist perspective a step further, working toward the creation of El Patronato, a group that supported the founding of La Universidad Autónoma de México in San Antonio. Until the end of her life, Carolina Munguía remained active. Next slide, please. Here she is being honored by her alma mater. In her advanced years, she was involved in the Shrine of the Little Flower, a Catholic organization devoted to Saint Therese of Lisieux. Munguía died on May 25th, 1977 in San Antonio. Identity and experience shaped both Carolina Munguía and Emma Tenayuca. Each pursued her goal of community betterment in ways that reflected her distinct vision of what was possible for women to accomplish. The outcomes also reflect the different paths chosen. Carolina Munguía was never ostracized for her work with La Raza and ended her days as a respected community activist in 1977. While Emma Tenayuca suffered from years of blacklisting in Texas, though she too enjoyed the respect and esteem of many San Antonians toward the end of her life, receiving many tributes at the time of her death in 1999. While Tenayuca called for reform rather than revolution, Tenayuca's demands carried certain revolutionary implications, especially in conservative Texas. For one, Tenayuca defended the rights of Mexican origin people, regardless of citizenship status. Moreover, in a nation that still defined Americanism in terms of whiteness, a struggle for the rights of people considered non-white was quite radical for the 1930s. Second, Emma Tenayuca never strayed from her working class grassroots origins. Tenayuca worked for toda la gente, all of the people, not just the gente decente. This attitude no doubt offended people with middle-class sensibilities, both Anglo and Mexican, who defined themselves in contrast to use the language that might have been heard at the time, la gente más corriente, those who failed to adhere to middle-class notions of respectability and female domesticity. Finally, and perhaps more radically, Emma Tenayuca broke with both Mexican and European American gender conventions of the time period on both the personal and professional levels. In her personal life, she carried herself with great confidence, speaking her mind and living her life without any inhibitions. The fact that she married an Anglo-American man with strong communist ties illustrates her willingness to act unconventionally on an intimate level. A few years later, this marriage ended, and as a divorced woman, she once again operated outside the acceptable social conventions of that time period. As a public person, she organized men and women. She formed coalitions across ethnic lines. She stormed the mayor's office. She led a historic strike. She banged on the doors of politicians and stirred up large crowds with inspirational speeches that earned her the nickname La Pasionaria, the passionate one. Together, these actions comprise the radical reform politics of Emma Tenayuca. In contrast, Carolina Munguía adhered to gender conventions by practicing the politics of benevolence. Munguía personified the popular ideal of middle-class respectability. From a privileged background, she was well-versed in languages, music, art, and the social graces. As expected, she gave up her career upon marriage. Married only once, her marriage lasted until death and produced 7 children. The energetic Munguía threw herself into child rearing and found time for the community service encouraged by her faith tradition. But unlike Tenayuca, her ideas of social betterment had more to do with an individual's moral and intellectual edification than structural changes in the environment. Munguía believed that self-improvement, along with charitable assistance, provided the best course for women of Mexican origin. This is not to say that Munguía failed to recognize the poverty and racism that defined people's lives in the barrio. Rather, her deeply ingrained ideas about women's proper sphere and roles created a circumscribed vision of what women could do in the struggle against these oppressive forces. Emma Tenayuca and Carolina Munguía pursued different organizational strategies, and yet the politics of benevolence and the politics of radical reform both involved cultural and political negotiations. Tenayuca and Munguía operated at the crossroads of gender, class, race, ethnic, and national boundaries. As different as their political strategies and tactics were, both women's historical possibilities were shaped by transnational realities of the Mexican Revolution, widespread poverty, labor exploitation, and racial discrimination of Mexicans in Texas. And I want to close just by stating that one thing I always tell my students when talking about these activists and other activists is that they often shared similar goals. right? How do you help people who are impoverished? How do you help people who are being exploited? But they went about it in different ways. And so I tell them that it is important, number one, to try to understand the different strategies, the different tactics, the different philosophies that inspire people to take action. Number two, to give them credit for taking action, because a lot of people are aware of problems around them in their society and they never do anything about it. And so the fact that these women and other women and men have been active in different ways is something to be acknowledged, to be recognized. So I tell them, you need to give credit where credit is due. You need to understand these differences and understand how the activist background can influence the choices that they make as activists, as adults in their environment. And so even if you don't agree with this strategy or that strategy, give some credit to the people for taking a position and going out into the community and doing their best. And so I think with that, I'll open it up for questions. Okay. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez. That was fascinating. So we've received multiple questions and comments. The first one is more of a comment. This is actually from Sergio Iruegas, who presented earlier this morning, and he just wanted to share that Senora Emma Tenayuca's charismatic leadership as an intermediary por la gente is a persistent indigenous cultural practice we see in Spanish exploration journals. Before and after the mission era, the people transplanted pecan tree saplings to places where they would live, and they also transplanted grapevines next to the pecan trees. We can still see evidence of these viticulture and arboriculture practices along the hike and bike trails near the river system. So that's just cool information.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Yes.
Yeah. And then there was a question about Maury Maverick. So if you know, what kind of organizations besides the Ku Klux Klan organized to get Maury Maverick ousted from politics? So what kind of forces were working together to achieve that?
I haven't done extensive research on Maury Maverick. I suspect, and this is speculation on my part, I'm going to leave it to the experts on his career to give us the definitive answer. But I would guess it was some of the organizations that I mentioned in the presentation. For instance, the veterans organizations were very angry with Maury Maverick because not just because he allowed for a Communist Party meeting to take place, but the location for the meeting, the municipal auditorium, which was a monument to World War I veterans, it was connected to that. Really, they found it offensive for him to allow that to happen. So I would venture that perhaps some of those veterans groups were part of that process. I mentioned the Elks. The Catholic Church was not very happy about the mayor's decision either. So it could have been a combination of right of center forces that were very upset.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. We do have a question, which it's hard to answer, I think, but we'll ask it. There are different schools in San Antonio that are named after people. And so there's a question about how could we get a school renamed after one of these women?
You know what's so fascinating? That question, I'm actually not surprised that it's being raised because I've also been doing speeches that have to do with Jovita Idar. another very famous person that spent a lot of time in San Antonio. And people are asking, how come we don't have schools in Laredo and San Antonio named after Jovita? And so this is a very valid question right now. And it is the centennial celebration, 100 years of women finally obtaining the right to vote, although the 19th Amendment is problematic because women of color were not able to vote even after the ratification in 1920 of the 19th Amendment. But it all gets to this issue of what's going on here. How come women haven't gotten their due? Women activists, people who have contributed in so many amazing ways to labor history, to women's history, to civil and human rights history. What's going on here? And so I actually, I feel heartened by the question. It makes me very happy that people are raising these questions because that's the first step. Step one, become aware of the inequities in the society. Step two, ask the question, how come there aren't these schools or parks, etc., named after folks? And we've been having this rather controversial debates about statues and monuments to certain historical figures. The flip side of that, the other side of that coin is, well, how come these other figures have never been acknowledged at all in public squares, in public forums? And so people involved in museums and in these debates about the public square and what that should look like, this is an opportunity for all of these professionals to, and historians as well, who put together these stories, and we're archival rats and we go in there and we dig around and interview people. It is an opportunity for all of us to engage this conversation, but also for our political leaders, who, especially our younger progressive political leaders who are trying to guide us in the 21st century. And they're also part of the story, and they can also lend their voices and support. I'm thinking like of the Castro brothers, for example, here, native to San Antonio. And I would predict that within the next few years, we may very well see more buildings and schools that are named after Latinas, and rightly so, and it is overdue. So thank you to the person who raised that question. You keep asking those, keep pressuring people.
Yeah, we're getting a lot of comments saying how much they enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, and so a question is, you mentioned these two different strategies that these two particular people had. Which do you consider to have the most impact on change? Maybe at that time, which do you think was more impactful? And then also, are there women of today who have similar social justice platforms?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. And I ask this question of my students for essays that I have them write. And I tell them there's no right or wrong answer. So don't be afraid. Don't try to game the system by asking me what my political beliefs are, because I'm not going to tell you. I don't want to censor you. If I start telling you what I think, then I'm going to censor you. And I want you to be honest. After reading about Emma Tenayuca and Carolina Munguía, I want you to come up with your own conclusion, but just be able to defend it. And I always get sort of a split, right? Half the class thinks Emma's way was better, and the other half thinks Carolina had the better approach. But what I like about my students is that they always give props, give credit to both. They say, well, I can appreciate both approaches, but me personally, given who I am and how I see the world, I would have gone this way, or I would have gone this other way. And I love that response, because again, I'm not about censoring anybody. I believe in freedom of speech, as long as you're not saying anything racist or, hurtful to anybody. But in any case, just looking at American history in this particular instance, but also others, I find that both the approach of, you could call it the more moderate approach. There's different ways of calling it, what Carolina was following. And then you can call Emma Tenayuca's a more radical, definitely left of center way. I find that both of these historically have been needed. Both strategies are important. They both have an important role to play in the political culture, and they kind of help one another, okay? And in the sense that certain elements of the body politic as well as the populace are going to listen to one type of activist, but not the other. And others will listen to an Emma Tenayuca, but won't listen to a Carolina Munguía. And so you need both voices out there to get the most, because remember, they were working for the same objectives in terms of they both wanted to help. They both wanted to help La Raza. You know, Carolina Munguía was very concerned that school children were not getting fairly treated because the parents couldn't get involved. If you have a PTA and all they speak is English, and you're talking about people that are part of the Mexican diaspora, essentially they're war refugees. How are these moms going to be advocates for their children if when they go to the meetings, they don't understand what's going on and they're being ignored? So providing a Spanish-speaking PTA is vital in helping that next generation get out of poverty, get a better education, and so on. So I find that to be, even though it is part of the politics of benevolence, it does have a reformish nature to it because she's trying to change the structure in a way that people find, quote, non-threatening, you know, in defense of children, in defense of families. But she's still trying to help La Raza. And Emma Tenayuca, of course, she is pointing out how exploitative the pecan shelling industry, the cigar rolling company industry, and all that are to women and their families. And she's pointing out, I didn't mention this in the presentation, but there's in the archives, there's letters that Emma wrote to Harry Hopkins and to other New Deal officials saying, you know what, FDR is doing a great job and he's trying to get all of these resources to the people, but our local officials are racist. And so they're the ones in charge of actually distributing the goodies, the resources, the programs. And instead of helping ethnic Mexican-American men and women get their fair share of the New Deal, they are sending them to do the lowest paid, most menial jobs, and they're missing out on all of these opportunities. So we need a voice like Emma's, right, in the body politic, in the political culture, to, you know, call it like it is. This is unfair. And she was very intelligent. She knew the U.S. Constitution. She knew the laws. She was a fan of FDR, and she kept track. She had like tons of newspaper clippings. So this was somebody that, you know, in our world, she would have been an AOC, right? She would have been a lawyer. She would have been a politician. She would have been in the thick of it. She had that kind of a mind. She was very sharp. So I feel like I feel very uncomfortable picking one over the other. I think they're both needed. And thank God for that. We need both voices. And what was the second part of the question? I think there was a second.
And they were asking about women of today who have similar social justice platforms. And you mentioned AOC, and I know there are more.
Yes, there's a lot more, and there's also more moderate women out there whose voices, I mean, if you just think back, you go back to the primary, the Democratic Party primary that we went through earlier. And, you know, we ended up getting a moderate, so to speak, Joe Biden as the one that is going to be representing the Democratic Party. But, you know, we had Julian as a more progressive voice in there. And so I would say that has always been the case, and not just with Latina politics. You look at the suffrage amendment struggle, there were moderate women in that, and even conservative women in favor of voting rights, but they had a more conservative approach. And then there were the more left of center radical women like Alice Paul, who chained herself to the White House fence and was demanding that Woodrow Wilson give women the democratic rights that supposedly the United States of America was fighting for in terms of Europe, the World War I situation. So all groups have their variability, their diverse political belief system. Everybody's on a particular spot on that political spectrum.
Yeah.
So one person is so excited. She says she wants to go back to school and take your classes. Um,
Oh, awesome. Thank
she
you.
she is asking about if anyone knows anything about scholarships for moms wanting to go back to school. I don't know if you know anything about that, but we can certainly try to find some resources and put them online.
Certainly. Well, I mean, UTSA has scholarships. I'm not very familiar with that, but I would definitely encourage people to, if you want to go back to school, if you absolutely. It's wonderful. And thank
Yeah.
you so much for joining us and for being so engaged. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and then there's just one final comment, and that's that this is a comment about how you described how important the PTA was, and they just are encouraging people to check out the Museo del Westside's online exhibit at the museodelwestside.org, which has some more information about Westside women who were active in the PTA.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so I want to thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. That was fantastic. I know people learned a lot today. Thank you so much for being here with us. And we look forward to what you have coming up next.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And I want to thank you, Sarah, for all the wonderful work that you are doing. Thank you so much. And everybody out there who is helping the community in any way, God bless you. Thank you so very much for all you do.
We'll be right back with Maria Zabal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Natalie Rodriguez, and I would like to introduce Maria Antonietta Berriozabal. She became the first Mexican-American woman to serve on the San Antonio City Hall in 1981, where she served for 10 years. Since then, she has remained civically engaged. Most recently, she served on the mayor's Housing Policy Task Force and continues to be a strong advocate for the community in many areas. Everyone, Maria Antonietta Berriozabal.
It's a privilege for me to be with you, honoring Emma in this way. She would be very happy to see Latinas engaged for the benefit of our comunidad in this manner. The topic I was given is the history of city policy in the West Side and the current policy challenges. Before I go into that, I want to share what the West Side means to me. Let me go back to some memories of my childhood in the West Side, to Picoso between Perez and Morales. Owning our own home was important for my parents, and that small house was our world. The study area for 6 children, our recreation space was our 25-foot lot, where a couple of mesquites and an old chicken coop provided plenty of opportunity for creative play. Our school and church provided not only a place to practice our faith and receive an education, but they were also the cultural and social center of our lives. We had no car, but the bus stop on Perez Street allowed us to go downtown and to the library. Checo's grocery store across the street was the place to take our cartera, where Checo or Homero would write in what we had purchased, and Daddy would pay on Friday when he cashed his weekly check after doing his laborer's work that kept our family clothed and fed. Spanish language movies and a weekly chapter at the church's back lot opened our world for the first time. We had our grandmother, Sebastiana, aunts, uncles living within walking distance. And we had opportunities for long or quick visits, a merienda on Sunday, and a place to celebrate Mother's Day. There were some bullies next door to our house, but we also had saints for neighbors, like La Señora Gomez, who brought us milk each day when my father got sick. The neighborhood, the Christ the King neighborhood, was my world, and it was good. At the time, I did not dwell on the fact that houses were limited to a 25-foot lot, or that if someone wanted to improve the house, there was redlining where there could be no loans, I did not give a second thought to the fact that when it rained, our backyard became a lake, and in our street, water got so high that we had to walk through a small river to get to school. I did not appreciate my father's hard work as a laborer, where he got miserable wages until he was invited to join the laborers' union. Our medical needs were met by home remedies, and we were lucky that no one ever got very ill because we had no health insurance. I have no idea how my family made it when my father got ill once and could not work. In time, I figured out why my mother would warn us against marihuanos. Those were shady characters that stuck around and did not work. When Nancy Reagan started the campaign of Say No to Drugs, I wondered what would have happened when problems with drugs were present in families in our barrios, and that it was an illness, but no one did anything about it. Drugs were always criminalized. Families, most who were immigrants from Mexico, like my grandmother and my parents, created a community that kept us safe. Families, when we talk about the West Side, there are many stories like mine. Families who raised children to contribute to their community and beyond. Strong institutions that reflected a significant culture and a language that created an environment of comunidad y respeto. Thriving family-owned businesses like Davila's Pharmacy, Centenos Grocery, restaurants with deliciosos platillos, the Polyclinic on San Saba downtown, where the first Mexican-American physicians set up business, nightclubs where people would gather for joyful occasions and dance like at La Gloria, Lermas, and fraternal organizations like La Sociedad de la Unión, and activist groups like LULAC and others. There was pride in KCOR, the first Spanish language station in the United States, and then KWEX, the first Spanish television station in the United States and beyond. There were Las Carpas, where people performed in tents, and also Spanish language theaters like the Alameda, Nacional, Guadalupe, Zaragoza. These provided not only space for Spanish language movies, but also a place for poets and artists of the day to share their gifts. Churches of all denominations, where we all went the day that the war ended, to thank God that the war had ended. We even had live theater in what is now the San Fernando Gym. In my world of the West Side, not until I got to that bus to go to high school did I relate regularly to people who were not Mexican or Mexican American, where everyone spoke Spanish. But a small sermon like Benito Juárez's, entre individuos como entre naciones, el derecho ajeno es la paz, among individuals as among nations. Respect for the rights of others is peace. That was one of my mother's favorite quotes, and it was a mantra that never left us. When I hear about the West Side, that this is what it means to me. This is my story, and there are thousands still out there, some very different than mine, some the same, but all form the strong foundation of the West Side neighborhoods of San Antonio. This cultural strength is worth maintaining. Its historic structures that are still standing should be preserved, even as we mourn those that we have already lost. We need to be grateful and supportive of those organizations, scholars, and community members who are working to preserve this history. The question is, how does city public policy fit into the lives of people living in the West Side today, in this time of pandemic, where resources are scarce and there are so many people who are suffering? First, let us list some of the areas that are public policy. We have health, housing, education, mobility and access, taxation, economic development, public spaces, water, energy, environment, infrastructure, recreation, climate issues, public safety, criminal justice, arts and culture, and others. A major hurdle that I see in examining city policy for the West Side is that there is no definition of the West Side. Of course, most of us would consider that District 5 is the West Side, but there are at least 5 major programs and plans by the city described as West Side that include sections out of District 5. 3 of these plans include parts of the inner city of the West Side. All have been created over the past several years. There are also the UTSA future development plans, which will grow into the west of the campus, or will grow west from the campus. These are at different stages of implementation, and some move faster than others. Together, they involved millions and millions of dollars in tax exemptions, special tax structures, I lost my place. SAWs and city waivers, various financing capacities, all for developers and their collaborators in the private sector. Projects are for redevelopment, infrastructure, new construction, housing, affordable and market rate, revitalization, and other purposes. There is also assistance in the form of zoning changes and other city regulations or waivers that also mean cash, although not direct. What I have behind me is my show and tell that represent these programs. They are the SA Tomorrow Westside Comprehensive Plan, the Westside Opportunity Zones, the Westside Tax Increment Reinvestment Zones, there's 3 of them, the Westside Reinvestment Plan, and then there's the Westside Development Corporation that works in a large part of the western part of the city, and they do development, new development. There's also urban renewal that came back in 2017, and the bond program that we call the 2022 bonds. There's the Inner City Revitalization Infill Program, or ICRIP, and there is the Center City Housing Incentive Policy, or CCHIP, and the UTSA expansion that I mentioned. While all impact some part of what we would describe as West Side, their boundaries are not the same. All include at least a part of District 5, but also other neighboring districts. Interestingly, the the SA Tomorrow Westside Comprehensive Plan goes all the way to Callahan Road on the west. We cannot say that nothing is being done, because all this is happening and concentrated in the place we call West Side, and or already substantial sums of money have been spent. But what does all this mean for us who care about the people who live in the West Side? How has their life improved, and how do you quantify the benefits or losses? It means that there were public processes in place when these plans were drawn. And a good question is how many people knew about all this activity? This also begs the question, how much public participation was involved in the planning? Who are the elected officials being held accountable for the work, since the city staff working on them not only plan and implement, but they are scattered throughout the city offices and departments. There's no one place that you can go to hold people accountable for all this. The most critical part of this review is the situation of the people who live in the West Side. There are 2 maps that I have behind me. They're in black and white, and I'm sure you can't see them. But one is the ICRIP map, the one with some little red dots. And the other one is the poverty map of San Antonio based on the 2010 census. The areas that have been declared for investment and revitalization happen to be the same areas where the poorest people live and the people with so many problems. And yet I don't see plans that were made before to take care of the people that were living there before all this activity came. This part of the city holds many of our precious and historic sites and structures, and the people, important groups of our community. With publicly incentivized new development, both the people and the structures are at risk. This is where my map to your left in the middle panel with black dots comes in. Oh, that's the poverty map. The very areas that are most vulnerable in our city are the ones that have been targeted for revitalization and development, as I have stated. From the first time I saw these maps, I love maps, I wondered if the question was asked, what will we do to assist the people who have been living in these neighborhoods for generations? Sadly, along the way, many homes and in some cases, entire sections of our older neighborhoods have been eliminated. The lonely map that I'm covering that has a blue area is also a sad statement. It's a map of the diabetes hospitalizations of people living in poverty in San Antonio. Poverty, I secured a few statistics from the latest SA 2020 report, and they are as follows. Poverty status is highest in District 5. It's 49% compared to 30% citywide. Median household income in District 5 is $28,500 as compared to the city's median income, which is $48,000. That's $20,000 less. The per capita income for the city, for District 5, is $13,800 compared to average per capita income for the city, that's $30,240. 49% of District 5 residents ages 1 to 64 have no health insurance compared to 32 citywide. Family violence by total population per 10,000 people in District 5 is 118 people. Citywide, it's 85. To this, I could add figures that are more difficult to secure by area, and they are food insecurity, rent and mortgage cost burdens, displacement, evictions. In other words, the historic problems of this area in our inner city continue. As many have already repeated, things were bad before COVID-19, and they have been made worse. We do not yet have data on where we are now because of loss of jobs, small business closures, and the direct impact of the virus on families and the community at large. The city of San Antonio just adopted its 2021 budget with $191 million for recovery and resiliency. The 4 pillars of the plan funded with CARES Act dollars and the general fund are housing assistance, small business support, workforce training, and digital inclusion. Admittedly, many of us have been disappointed and somewhat frustrated that not more funding was allocated for immediate needs due to the COVID-19 crisis that will continue. In addition, there was funding for housing, public health, homelessness, mental health, assistance for children, youth, and seniors, education as in pre-K for SA, Alamo Promise for college scholarships, and Project Quest for job training. There's also infrastructure spending like curbs and sidewalks. The issue is not that areas of concern are totally ignored. For me, the deep concern is that when I look at what the city spends on and invests on programs that I first mentioned, all these maps behind me, which impact the inner city, the funds are so much larger than what we spend directly assisting the people with the many problems that face this area of town and others, I might say. What all these works boil down to is that we as residents of this city who care about what happens to the West Side, this significant part of town, have to find ways to become more engaged. We do not all have the same level of resources, time, or even health. And we are all very limited because of COVID-19. But we still have an obligation to be informed on what is going on, what is being done with our taxes. Those of us who have computers and lucky enough to have the internet can access city websites and free news stories. We can also view city council meetings, council committee meetings, zoning, and other public meetings. We must continue to insist that the city provide the best technological vehicles for us, the public, to engage in these meetings virtually. I know that there are people who have been active, who have done all they can to improve the lives of others, to assist with issues of housing, evictions, displacement, who work hard to prevent destruction of our precious sites and structures in the West Side. There are those who have organized around climate change, have coalesced around police issues and justice for people of color, pursued just policies on water and energy, demand protection of our Edwards Aquifer, and many other social justice issues. And at times we are disappointed, frustrated, and even angry because there are forces that stand in the way, but we cannot give up. We need to continue joining with others, creating coalitions. And to the young, I say, the work is for the long haul. And I deeply value and appreciate your work. The young people who have taken the baton of justice and will carry it into the future long after my generation is gone. To all, I say adelante, and also close with a prayer that's attributed to one of my muses, Bishop Oscar Romero, who says, not all of us can do everything, but each of us can do something, and there is great hope in that. Gracias.
Oh,
Buenas tardes. My name is Graciela Sanchez, and thank you for being with us this afternoon or this entire 4 hours. I work as one of the Buena Gente of the Esperanza Peace Justice Center. And with me this afternoon is Antonia Castañeda.
Buenas tardes, soy Antonia Castañeda. I am a member of the Westside Preservation Alliance, the WPA, and Buena Gente of the Esperanza. Thank you. Mil gracias por acompañarnos este día, estas 4 horas. Esperamos que sigan con nosotros. We hope you will continue with us and that this final session is not your last session or your last time with us.
Yeah, and I also want to shout out that I'm also a member of the Historic Westside Residents Association, also a member of the Westside Preservation Alliance, and working alongside the campaign of the Barrio No Se Vende. We wanted to start our talk by showing you a film that was made, a short documentary that was made back in 2002 to commemorate the struggle and the fall of a beloved building called La Gloria. So Natalie, you can roll that video.
Mi abuelita, Doña María, is like my God. She's my spirit ghost guardian from the other side. Every once in a while, I pray to her, like Thursday evening after our court hearing. Underneath la luna llena, coixauqui volando, I prayed to my grandmother to watch over La Gloria. With burning smoke, I walked a circle of protection around the building and lit a candle to Santa Marta. Marta slayed dragons. That was her milagro. When they found out that dragons didn't exist, they took away her sainthood. White light burning for Santa Marta. I thought that she and the spirit of my grandmother would help us fight our demonios, our demons. Gente hecha de corazón de piedra, que no ven, no escuchan, que no sienten. But the wind was burning strong that evening and blew the candle out. I looked up at the sky and saw the moon embarazada hidden behind the clouds, and I tried to imagine the people dancing on the rooftop of La Gloria. Black dresses brushed the tops of trees as they danced against the sky, 3 shades of blue touching each other underneath a full moon. My grandmother danced here, someone told me, and she is with you now. An 82-year-old woman donated $40 while we were fundraising for the building and said, "I'm going to dance there again," pointing to the dance floor in the sky. My own grandmother, the one I prayed to, never danced at La Gloria, nor did my mother. But that Monday after Easter, when they tore La Gloria down, I cried. Each time the bulldozer hit the building, I felt it in my heart, and I remembered my own history. Mi mami, una sata atrás india y china, inmigrante, inglés hablado con acento, piel morena, nariz de olmeca. I remembered my own history. My grandmother, warrior woman, body of Coatlicue, partera, tortillas brought fresh from the tortilleria because she refused to cook. I remembered my own history. Mi piel más güera, being made fun of because of the way I spoke English, being made fun of because of the way I spoke Spanish. Each time the bulldozer hit the building, I felt it in my heart, and I remembered my own history, my 6 nieces and nephews, and wondered, who will tell them the stories of their people? Each time the bulldozer hit the building, I felt it in my heart, and I thought silently, this is cultural genocide. To take away our history is to kill our people. our soul, our spirit. I watched them tear La Gloria down and knew that even though my grandmother had never danced there, she was there that day too. With every brick fallen, I heard her say, "We cannot forget."
So that was a very, I always feel very emotional after I see La Gloria. I was 40 years old when that building came down. And finally, I felt I had some agency. I was an adult. I could do something. And like the many people you saw around, surrounding the building, trying to save La Gloria, you know, there was just this moment that so many people in the community, people I never met, some people who were friends and allies, we all came together to save La Gloria. And it didn't matter how much the community wanted and demanded. Ultimately, it seemed like the power was in the hands of the business community. It was in the hands of a council member, a council person representing District 5 that didn't listen to his constituents. The first image that's up here right now is, I wanted to center myself, Graciela Sanchez, as somebody born and raised in the West Side, somebody born in the historic West Side, somebody who's, in this image, this is an image of my grandfather, who is the little boy on the right-hand side with the hat on his lap. And that's 1908. And his family, my great-grandfather, moved into this neighborhood of the historic West Side in the 1890s. And this is J.T. Brackenridge. So this is catty corner to the Guadalupe Theater where we're at right now. Next slide. The next image is an image of my mother, who's the little 1-year-old on the lap of her grandmother, Doña Teresita Cantú, who also, and also there is standing the younger woman standing by her side is my grandmother, Abuelita Panchita. These 3 women helped to form who I am, and they were activists in the 1890s and the 1900s up through the 1930s and 40s, demanding for better quality services for their community. My grandmother knocking on doors, trying to get electricity into the homes in the neighborhood, helping to take care of the people dying of tuberculosis and other diseases. There's just so much here, but I only say that because a lot of the work that we're doing here around historic preservation, a lot of the work that we do to help work towards social, economic, environmental, and gender justice is seen as outsider, is seen as, people like ourselves are not recognized as San Antonio citizens, much less people who are from the west side of San Antonio. So I just wanted to be honored and respected, and just to say that there are many of us that are doing this work, born and raised in this community, and those empower me to respect that we also know that we also have a voice, and that this voice should be respected, because we speak for many, many, many thousands of people who have been ignored, as María mentioned. Next slide. So the next slide goes back to the image and the struggle around La Gloria. By the end of that struggle, before they started tearing down La Gloria, we had gone before the court and asked the judge to stop the demolition. And when we raised the question about racial inequality, when we talked about equal protection under the law, the judge didn't want to talk about it because we were going to have to raise the questions of race and racism. And he said, we will not talk about racism in my court. So for our attorney not to be able to raise the concerns of equal protection, we lost our case, because the critical issue was, how does the city protect the history and the culture and the casitas and traditions of the West Side? At that point in 2002, there were no historic districts in the West Side. And except for the fact that last month, the Esperanza became the first historic district in the West Side, almost 20 years later, without that historic designation, our neighborhoods, our casitas are constantly in trouble, because there are developers and development and visionaries that have a different vision of the neighborhood than we. So we tried to save it. We even gave them the $260,000 that the owners wanted for that building, and it didn't matter. Next slide. So this next image is an image of what we created. In the previous discussion, we had Steve Tillotson and Is Reyna talking about a lot of the history and research they did on the casitas, the neighborhood, and in 1984. And I think Steve or Lee, one of the two, mentioned how they thought that the research was going to help to preserve the neighborhood. It's like many research papers that we do. They get written up and then they get put away in somebody's shelf and never read and never respected, more importantly. So sadly, most of those buildings have come down. And this image shows the area around Guadalupe, El Paso to the north, Montezuma to the south, east on Brazo Street and west on San Jacinto. And everything in pink are buildings that existed that got torn down. And everything in yellow are the buildings that, thank goodness, are still around. But one of the buildings was threatened to be torn down, and that was Casa Maldonado. So we've used this map constantly when we do walking tours in the neighborhood. And actually, this area that's all pink is where the plaza currently exists, most of these. So to build the plaza, we had to tear down people's homes. Next slide.
Yes, so, take up the mic. Thank you, Graciela. That moves us right into the basis and the reason. Graciela has provided the solid background of why we needed to form our own organization that focused on historic preservation of the working class history, culture, and structures on the west side of San Antonio, the historic west side of San Antonio. So we established the Westside Preservation Alliance in 2009. And we established it around an issue. The issue at that time was Casa Maldonado, which is just here down the street, not even just half a block from where we are now in the Guadalupe Theater. And we established the Westside on 3 basic principles on which we still operate. And those are 1, concientización, consciousness raising, because historic preservation offices and people in the city, politicians, as well as people in our own community, did not necessarily focus on the importance of and the need to recognize, honor, and preserve working class Mexican American history, culture, and structure. So consciousness raising, concientización. So we speak every place we can, and certainly speak and we advocate and we argue in front of City Council, in front of the Zoning Commission, in front of the HDRC, the Historic Review and Design Committee. We challenged and now have a solid working relationship with the Office of Historic Preservation of the city. Actually, our work around one of the buildings, around the Univision, which we'll talk about later, resulted in the establishment of a position of cultural historian in the Office of Historic Preservation. The second issue in principle is policy, and as Maria has said, and as Graciela has indicated, and we will continue to comment on, the policies that frame the Office of Historic Preservation in the city and in all cities did not and does not account for the history, culture, and structures of the West Side and of working class communities. And so we worked very hard, we continue to work very hard to change policy. And we'll come back to that around the last building that we'll talk about, the Alasana Match Courts, and the policies that Saha is implementing. And finally, our third principle is saving West Side history, culture, and structures. So with that, let me turn it back to Graciela.
So after La Gloria came down, we had a momentum. A lot of people talked about trying to create a heritage organization. And then Casa Maldonado pops up. Suddenly, one of the nonprofits received $4.9 million to create a Promesa project. And that Promesa required them to tear down Casa Maldonado, which is this building, which was also known as the Pink Building. And here you have community members, especially the elders, who actually approached us and said, you know, right now we're alive and we can tell you our history and we can tell you what the neighborhood looks like because you're asking us, what does this neighborhood look like? But at some point we're gonna die. And when we pass away, we can't tell you that history, but at least, you know, if you have the buildings, you will have a sense of what the neighborhood looked like because the buildings are around. But, you know, they're gonna tear down this building and you can't have that happen. So it was the impetus of the elders demanding that we stand with them to save Casa Maldonado that created this moment. And I remember reaching out to Antonia and said, again, it's another building, what do we do? And that, so all the three ideals and goals for Westside Preservation Alliance got created at that time. And we fought hard. It was starting in 2008 and not till 2011. You know, we heard so much of internalized racism from our community because like, it's old, it's ugly, there are bees in there and there are rats in there, it's got to be torn down. It was sadly another sad moment because a lot of the arguments in favor of tearing it down came from members of the community, and the solidarity that we were hoping to get from other nonprofits and community members wasn't holding strong. But after those 2 or 3 years, we finally succeeded. Next slide. And the next slide shows a before and after. At the top is the pink building, as if, you know, we were able to get $500,000 from the city of San Antonio. Julian Castro came out, saw the building, and said, let's get money for it. And it didn't come to us. It came to the Avenida Guadalupe, that was the owners of that building, and they were able to save it. And the building below is the now newly renovated, or at least 5-year renovated Casa Maldonado. And as soon as it was renovated, they immediately got people to rent the space. I want to move quickly to the next slide. While we were struggling with Casa Maldonado, Lermas, which is at 500 North Zamora, came up, and Susana Segura and many, many community members who had been community members who attended Lermas and danced at the dance hall of Lermas, you know, were surprised, and they all coalesced, and then they also reached City Council to demand that it get preserved. And after many, many meetings at the DSDB, what is now known as the Building Standards Board, they were able to convince the council to save it. But one thing is to save it, another thing is to preserve it. So here you have a 1940s image. Lermas was built in 1942, and by the time you see the bottom image, it's probably what that looked like back in 2010. The same shot, more or less, of the Lakeview cleaners. But again, our community many times doesn't have money. Individuals don't have money to renovate, and there are no policies in the city to help community members renovate their own buildings. So we were able to negotiate with the owners. Next slide.
So I'm going to interrupt for a moment just to underscore, as we're going through these slides, what these structures represent historically and culturally. So La Gloria, for example, certainly was a reflection of an example of the culture and social relationships and social events and social history of the West Side. So that's where people did quinceañeras, they did bodas, they did celebrations, family weddings, anniversaries, todo, baptisms. The Casa Maldonado represented, when we were working to save it, we were told it has no history, it has no importance. Well, Casa Maldonado represents labor history, political history, sports history. The person who owned it, William Bill Maldonado, was an activist in our community. Lerma, certainly, again, music history. That's the home, that's the birth of Conjunto and Tejano. All of the major musicians, the Jimenez brothers and others, Lidia Mendoza played there. And these are musicians who are now Smithsonian Heritage Fellows, National Fellows, recognized as producing American music. So let me turn it back to Graciela.
Yes, so the image you have right now in front of you then is the future Lermas. And so it's beautiful. And I think after demanding money, because one of the concerns we've had is that, again, the city has not even set aside, not only to support individuals to preserve their own homesteads, but even nonprofits. And when we were raising monies for Lermas, I raised the question to Julian Castro and said, Julian, do you understand that the city hasn't supported any nonprofit cultural organization for to save a building since the Guadalupe got saved, and that was 30 years ago. So through the efforts of Roberto Trevino and his council colleagues, we were able to get $500,000, and then we were able to get another $500,000 from the county. And so we raised $1 million. If you're still around and you want to see that, must help us raise money. We still have lots more to go, but we hope that by January of 2021, we'll be having festivities there. And we're going to have to go quickly. So next slide, we have images of Bacilla frogs. So Antonio, do you want to talk about the Bacilla frogs?
Well, I do want to underscore, well, two things. Yes, thank you, Graciela. This is a very important building pertaining to labor and particularly gender, because the people who work here in the clothing industry, the textile industry, were women.
Yes, so again, lots of developers are getting smart rather than just going directly to the city. They're now hiring lobbyists, and that's what was one of our big surprises, individuals like Bill Kaufman, who have been doing a lot of development, lobbying for developers downtown, who are suddenly coming to the west side. What they wanted to build was a dollar store, tear down a 1979 structure, one of the most beautiful ones in the west side, just to make it a dollar store. We have we have more dollar stores than probably most neighborhoods. But luckily it got saved, and the Westside Development Corporation is talking about the renovation. So go out and talk to them. Next slide is Univision. Well, Univision actually is known prior to Univision as Casa OR, started by Raúl Cortés back in 1955 as the nation's first Spanish-only TV outlet. And it was sold in 1961, and Emilio Nicolas Sr. is a general manager for the next 30 years. So the few images here show a camera, people live at the studio at Casa OR, and they also talk about being the fourth TV network. And then the next image is the image of Univision in 2013. And again, community members, city leaders, once again said, well, it's not pretty, it's not anything special. What's the issue? So it gets torn down, and the final image that we have is Express News photo, just seeing the devastation after we lost in court. We try to save Univision.
Univision, the building itself was representative of just a singularly important dimension of Mexican-American history in general and San Antonio history in particular, because Casa OR, first a radio station, then a television station, is the first Spanish language radio and television station in the United States. And it is founded and lives here in San Antonio. And major celebrities, political, everything, education, todo, were here and spoke and were present. And the broadcast, even though I was raised in the state of Washington and we didn't get the broadcast, but we heard about it from people who came from San Antonio and were working in the fields alongside of us. So language, business, music, entertainment, all of those historical issues were represented in that building.
Next slide. Another building besides Univision that we lost to development is the Malt House, which was originally built in 1949. And I think this was one of those buildings that a lot of community members came to because it was a social space. People went to the Malt House to eat after games with, the folks versus the La Tecla, after city council meetings or county commissioners meetings, a lot of the politicos showed up. So the malt house meant a lot to a lot of people. It got destroyed, and what we have is 7-Eleven, a convenience store. I really think we need to move on. So yes. So the next slide is the Alazan courts, and the Alazan courts were part of the WPA, the program of the 1930s, and responding to the Depression, and community members, starting with Father Trancasi at Guadalupe Church, had a whole writing campaign between himself and the FDR administration, and finally was able to convince Eleanor Roosevelt to come to San Antonio in 1938, I believe. And she toured the West Side and was able to convince her husband, Franklin Roosevelt, to make sure monies got given to the West Side so that the Alazan courts got built. And they were, the architect for the Alazan courts, Alazan Apache courts, is also the same architect that built the Alameda, which we always talk about how beautiful, how exciting, and we would never think of tearing down the Alameda. But Strauss Neinka is the architect. And Antonietta, do you want to talk a little bit more about it? Because we just got the Alazan courts designated as one of the 11th most endangered buildings in the nation on September 24th.
The Alazan courts, pardon me, represent a very historic moment in U.S. history because it is the development of public housing, major projects, and San Antonio establishes the San Antonio Housing Authority very early on. It's one of the earliest housing authorities that are established. And so Alazan Apache Courts has is a symbol of presence of public affordable housing in the West Side and of the historic and contemporary Alazan Apache Courts community that is deeply embedded and is a central part of the community of the West Side. This, out of the Alazan Apache Courts, out of its history, come very significant people. We believe that Ltia Mendoza did not live there, but she certainly played in its environs. Judge Al Alonso was raised at Alazan Apache Courts, as was Gloria Rodriguez, who later comes back to Alazan and establishes Avance, a major program that works with women and children and is still present there.
And what's really important to also recognize is people live at the Alazan Apache Courts. The current status from the San Antonio Housing Authority is to tear down the Alazan Courts because they're old, there's not enough money to rehab them. But we know if they get designated historic at the state and national level, they can also get tax credits. And there are developers in this country, they're already reaching out to us so that they can reach out to Saha, so that they can help renovate, restore, and make the Alazan Courts the 5-star housing that it was back in the late 30s, in the 40s. And so we ask you to go to the 11th most endangered building site through the National Trust for Historic Preservation. There's an advocacy piece where you can press a link and sign on and ask the president and David Socha to save the Alazan Courts, as well as Chad Guzman, who's the chair of the board of Saha. 1,200 individuals will lose their homes. They will be displaced. They will be pushed out, who knows where, and they deserve to be here, and our community deserves to stay here. This is beautiful, a beautiful community, and so we ask you to join us as well. And next slide. And that was just an image of contemporary Alazan Courts. And they look fine to me. And the next image talks about the work that we're doing with both the Esperanza and the Westside Preservation Alliance, along with the other community groups like the Historic Westside Residents Association, which is, recognizing that we live in a rich cultural corridor, and we deserve to preserve our people and the buildings. So we, under normal circumstances, and since 2010, we've been doing Paseo por el Westside during Historic Preservation Month, and we, and there's just so many images, and we run out of time because I go. So just go on to other images. We've done walking tours, and we again are interested in training people to learn more about that history and help us. And we also just gathered the sabiduría of our sabias and sabios. So we're doing workshops in the community, giving talks, and we're also centering the people from this community because they know. Again, it's not the outsiders that always know, that seem to tell us about our community and what's best for us. We also know. So the last few slides are about Ruben's Ice House, which we purchased back in 2007, and we are in the midst of trying to create Museo del Westside. So we ask you also to talk to your council people, to Shirley Gonzalez, to other community members, and say we need a museo for the Westside, because this museo is going to tell the history of the working class people of San Antonio.
So the Museo del Westside represents then a community institution of Westside history and culture. And the city or nobody else is going to build this museum. So we need to build it to recognize, to honor, to sustain, to maintain for ourselves and for future generations of the children of the Westside, but also of San Antonio and of the United States, so that the history and culture of this community that is so important to the city as well as to the rest of the state and the nation is retained, is kept, is visible, is present. So we need your energy, your knowledge, your presence, your work. Join us, come work with us at the museo, building the museo, and preserving the structures and the history and the culture of the Westside. And so to connect with us, we'll call the Esperanza at 210-228-0201, or send us an email at esperanzacenter.org. Thank you.
I don't know that there are any questions. I couldn't see them necessarily. No questions. Okay, that just means that you all have to really reach out to us. This whole symposium was put together by the Westside Preservation Alliance and the Esperanza. And so programs like this, it was quite educational. I know you know that. We've learned, and you're going to want to share today's symposium with friends and family members, because there's just a lot of important information. And there will be many more. So next year, 2021, we'll have another series of Westside history, culture, and traditions through the Tenayuca Symposium series. And I want to thank Dr. Antonia Castaneda and Dr. Arturo Madrid, who helped actually push this forward, and Dr. Sarah Gould. So thank you very much for that. Antonia?
Thank you, and thank you to the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center for hosting us at the theater.
Hello, everybody. My name is Cristina Ballí, and I'm the Executive Director of the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. And I just want to close this, help close this symposium, this day-long symposium, by thanking the Esperanza Peace Justice Center for initiating this effort. We are happy, very, very happy to be able to partner with you. And aquí estamos a su disposición, for this always. We're happy that the Guadalupe Theater was able to be part of this, and we're just sorry that we couldn't do it live for everybody, hosting you here in person, but we are in this historic moment trying to join everybody as we're all trying to get past, this historic moment in time that is difficult, and and we were able to help put this symposium together regardless. I also want to say that I want to thank the Esperanza Peace Justice Center, the Westside Preservation Alliance, for all the historic preservation work going on around here. Us at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center, we're trying to do our part, with the buildings that we own here in this corner, including the Guadalupe Theater, the Progreso Pharmacy that I mentioned at the beginning, that did get bond funding for restoration. Hopefully that will open up soon as a community gallery and a bookstore and gift shop for people of the community, especially a bookstore, a Latino bookstore, that we feel is really necessary here. So just once again, thank you very much to everybody. These videos will be available on Facebook and on YouTube, I imagine. They're going to be there for forever, so you can listen to these lectures anytime you like. Anytime you like, you can return back to them. You can find the links on the Esperanza's page. You can also find them on the Guadalupe's page. We'll put them on the Guadalupe page as well. The Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center has been sharing this symposium all day, also on our Facebook page, sharing all this information, so you can return to it at any time. And lastly, I do want to say thank you to the City of San Antonio for allowing the management of this theater to the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. This is a partnership. This building is owned by the City of San Antonio, managed by the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. And we also want to do some advocating. Next bond package, a lot of us are going to have a lot of building needs on our bond packages. For next bond package, we are also going to want some funding to do some restorations in this theater as well. We have to do some very necessary upkeep on it as well. So, all of us are trying to keep these efforts in mind, trying to work together to move towards them. Nuevamente, muchas gracias. Thank you, Graciela. Thank you, Dr. Castañeda. Thank you, Sarah Gould, who has been working very, very hard on this. And thank you to our staff, Jorge Gamboa and Jorge Pina, who were working behind the scenes as well. So, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros.
On the other end, we have Natalie Rodriguez, Amelia Valdez, and Isbart Wilk, who are also helping us.